Good evening and welcome to The Proof is Out There. Apollo 16 was NASA's 5th successful moon landing mission. One of its primary objectives, to inspect, survey, and collect rock and soil samples from the lunar surface. But did this moon mission encounter extraterrestrial life as well? And did NASA bury the truth? April 25th, 1972. The Apollo 16 command module, Casper, has spent a total of 5 days in lunar orbit, circling the moon a total of 64 times. But due to issues with the service module engine, the crew redocks with the command module and departs for Earth 1 day earlier than planned. As the men pull away from the moon, they film a truly unexpected sight through the window. A disc-shaped structure appears to be moving in an unusual trajectory above the lunar surface. It appears to have a dome in its center and a horizontal line or bar sticking out. The camera looks away, but shifts back once more in time to catch a final glimpse of the object. This video has long drawn the attention of UFO enthusiasts.
It's understandable that people would see this and think it is a UFO. This kind of has that classic circular or disc-like shape that UFOs typically have, but also it's at the moon. We don't know a lot about the moon. It's a very alien environment, and people who are convinced that NASA has been withholding evidence of aliens would point to this as evidence that NASA missed hiding.
Hang on. Could NASA really be hiding signs of extraterrestrial life? Well, one of history's most esteemed astronauts said yes.
Ed Mitchell was an Apollo astronaut, and he was the lunar module pilot on Apollo 14, which meant he walked on the surface of the moon. And he maintained throughout his life that NASA had evidence of alien life. He was sure that there were some extraterrestrials out there that they had engaged with.
Plus, at least one expert has analyzed the footage.
In 2003, Japanese engineer Hiroshi Nakamura wrote an article hypothesizing that this disk could only be an extraterrestrial object. He said that it is the only explanation consistent with mission data.
According to Nakamura's analysis, the object's wobbly movement is indicative of something three-dimensional, and its width, estimated by comparing it to the craters on the moon, could be as big as 70 miles.
There are a lot of questions about this footage and plenty of unknowns, which kind of explains why this clip of the footage is so popular among UFO circles.
According to NASA, people have now taken more than 4 million photos in space. Does this footage stand out among the rest as proof that something or someone is out there? Before making one giant leap to conclusions, we check with our experts. First, a theory promoted by debunkers over the years. This was just a glimpse of Earth.
The reason why this could not be the Earth is because the Earth should be larger than what we've seen here. It specifically has 2 circular bands. Unless there was a hurricane that was going around the Earth at a high rate of speed, there is no way that this particular object could be the Earth.
Some believe the object wasn't even really there, that it was a reflection from the window. But there's an easy way to tell.
Camera reflections would be either an internal reflection or a lens flare, and they have a characteristic look to them. We would actually see the brightest spot, and it would look like a fuzzy thing over here on the opposite side of the field. It wouldn't be right next to it here. It'd be across the center of the frame. It looks to me like we're seeing a physical object.
Could it truly be some sort of spacecraft like a UFO, as Nakamura suggested? Well, we see one big problem with Nakamura's analysis. He presumed that the object was as far away as the moon, and therefore huge. But our analysis puts this object closer to the camera, and therefore smaller.
When the camera moves around, the object doesn't change position at all relative to the command module. So what that's telling me is that this object is probably literally right outside the command module. It's not very far away at all.
And that's not all the camera movement reveals.
The fact that the camera moved towards the object and then moved back, I do not believe the astronaut thought that that object was that important. And none of the astronauts have came out and said that they saw extraterrestrials on their mission.
My feeling is that this is a spotlight fixture on the command module. This here is the stalk with the wire. This thing right here looks to me like a funnel-shaped light shield to help increase the brightness. And then that thing we see in the middle could be a light bulb.
But why would a spaceship need a spotlight?
On Apollo 16, they had to actually go outside the command module and do what's called an EVA, an extravehicular activity. And when they did the EVA, or the spacewalk, they had to use additional lighting. So it was the EVA floodlight housing and mount on the command module of the Apollo 16.
We agree with D'Antonio. This is an EVA floodlight. NASA's Artemis program is scheduled to land astronauts on the moon's south pole as early as 2027. If they spot anything strange, we'll be sure to let you know. We want to talk about another kind of UFO encounter now, ones in which the eyewitness is allegedly injured. Unfortunately, there are many accounts of such events, like this one, which has become one of the most famous Canadian UFO incidents of all time. It's May 20th, 1967. After a relaxing weekend prospecting along Manitoba's Falcon Lake, amateur geologist and World War II veteran Stefan Mihalik returns to his hometown of Winnipeg, where he immediately goes to the emergency room. Stefan is vomiting repeatedly, fighting to remain conscious. That's when his shirt is opened to reveal a gruesome sight. A series of dark, circular burns protrude from Stefan's torso in a precise, grid-like pattern.
He was prospecting for silver and quartz when he saw two red glowing crafts in the sky. One of them took off and then one of them landed, so he decided to go get a closer look. As he got closer, he smelled sulfur and saw some really bright lights. And when he reached out to touch the craft began to spin, and he was actually knocked down by a burst of air that set his clothes on fire. A lot of people thought that this was a UFO, but Mihalik actually believed it was a secret military craft.
Mihalik's youngest son, Stan, vividly remembers the day his dad went to the ER.
My dad, who didn't want to get into it with this doctor, tells him it was an aircraft accident. He was scared. Here's a man who's been through the Second War. Here's a man who's been to the concentration camps, and he was terrified.
According to Stan, the doctors treat his father's burns, but he continued to suffer from periodic blackouts, swelling, diarrhea, and nausea, all symptoms of radiation sickness.
The Canadian government grabbed some of his clothing and some of the soil out there, which were both found to be radioactive. There was also radioactive metal embedded in rocks and a 15-foot diameter circle that was newly devoid of any vegetation or moss.
The case became so big that even the U.S. government pitched in to assist the investigation. And some see similarities to another infamous case, the 1980 Rendlesham Forest incident, where two U.S. servicemen claimed to have encountered a UFO deep within the woods near a U.S. Air Force base in England.
All the radios of all the cops were kind of going nuts that something was in the forest right outside of the joint UK and United States base known as Bentwaters. These two police officers for the Air Force, Peniston and Burroughs, actually go out into the forest to try to locate the downed UFO, and lo and behold, they find it. Both witnesses report not only a brilliant bright light, but feeling this static charge in the air as they got close. Burroughs indicated to me that injuries that he sustained created havoc to his health, heart complications, and a loss of vision. All of those are very consistent with radiation poisoning.
In 2015, Burroughs received disability benefits for his condition, which suggests that something did indeed happen to him. But what about those burns on Mihalik's stomach? Let's turn to our experts. First, did Stefan Mihalik's symptoms conform to radiation poisoning?
His reports say that these symptoms lasted for weeks. You're really going to see those acute symptoms for 2 days. Then you have a latent period, and we would have seen abnormalities in his blood work, almost akin to people who undergo radiation or chemo. But the reports that I reviewed showed that he had normal blood work.
And as far as these peculiar marks being radiation burns?
With radiation burns, usually the zone of damage is going to be bigger. It's not just going to be a small pattern. To me, this looks like something made contact with just that area of skin as opposed to a blast. It's almost like somebody took an item like this and pressed it against his chest.
However, not everyone is as skeptical.
This story matches so many other encounters like this, where you have physical evidence and evidence of burn injuries to a human body. If this is actually an injury from ionizing radiation, that would imply some sort of very collimated beams of radiation.
Unlike radiation from microwaves or radio waves, ionizing radiation contains enough energy to damage living tissue.
You can have ionizing radiation from radioisotopes used perhaps as fuel for some sort of black ops, exotic aircraft, or spacecraft.
Then there are the findings from the site investigation.
When the area of the sighting was studied, radiation was found, not only in the soil, but pieces of metal found in the crushed vegetation. In my opinion, this is an unexplainable story. Over 50 years later, this remains one of Canada's greatest UFO mysteries.
The incident happened, we have the evidence, we just don't know what it was.
Our verdict? This infamous case still remains an unexplained incident. Unfortunately, we may never get to the bottom of this story, but hopefully continued research will shed more light on the alleged injuries sustained during UAP encounters. When you think about the world's great archaeological destinations, you may picture the Egyptian pyramids or the Greek Parthenon. But what if I told you there were potentially even greater wonders hiding in a little-known Balkan forest? March 2016, near the city of Zavidovici, Bosnia, Dr. Samir Osmanagic, sometimes called the Bosnian Indiana Jones, is exploring a forest outside the town when he spots a strange object that immediately grabs his attention. An enormous, seemingly sculpted sphere is wedged into the ground, standing in stark contrast to the natural wilderness surrounding it. It appears to show some weathering, with chips and lines on the surface, but for the most part, it is smoothly curved. Its seemingly perfect shape has Dr. Osmanagic wondering if something unnatural is at play.
You start thinking, hey, who were the people who were building all this? It had to be much more advanced civilizations. Today, you would need a huge pieces of equipment to shape it, to move it. We took precise measurements. It is more than 3.5 meter radius. It is 37.4 tons. This is by far the most massive stone sphere on the planet.
This Bosnian sphere isn't traceable to any known civilization. However, there are some wild theories.
Some people say this sphere would be evidence of a super advanced human civilization living in the area years ago that we have no idea about. There were stone spheres discovered in Costa Rica in the 1930s. They were hand-carved by the discs culture between 600 and 1000 AD, but they're significantly smaller than the spheres found in Bosnia, which are twice as heavy.
Could an ancient civilization in the Balkans have created this mysterious sphere? In 2018, researchers discovered that the Great Pyramid of Giza can concentrate electromagnetic energy at its base. Osmanagic claims that an advanced ancient civilization did the same thing here, creating this sphere to harness energy.
The ancients knew that if they placed such structures in those particular shapes, that they were going to amplify the energy.
Dr. Osmanagic once claimed that he'd found an ancient pyramidal complex just like the one in Giza in the Balkan Hills. Again, he said that this structure was the work of an advanced civilization and capable of amplifying energy. Osmanagic's claims have received support from the Bosnian government. But can we believe his claims about this mystery sphere? Let's ask our experts. First, we look into the idea that these Bosnian spheres are advanced tech wielding powerful energy.
This one itself, in the picture, you can see that there's a big missing piece of the sphere, and there's this crack here. For me, they're too random to be specifically carved to be a shape that could produce energy. I would think that they would be perfect. However, when you really look at the sphere, none of them are perfectly round.
It turns out geology, and not an advanced civilization, is the true force behind this massive stone.
The Bosnian sphere is one of a number of examples of a global phenomena called concretions. These are stones. Sometimes they'll start around a walnut or a stick, but as they roll through rivers of certain pitch that are made of mostly limestone, all that particulate sticks to the ball, and it rolls over time and it becomes kind of a snowball. The geologic process of how these balls form is very well known, it's very well documented, and it's not debated. There are some on the coast of Japan, there are some in Oregon, there are a few that are on the coast of New Zealand. There are a number of natural examples in the Theodore Roosevelt National Park in the United States. When you put those into the perspective, the process is very common. What's uncommon is them getting to very large size, like the ones in Bosnia.
Our verdict, we're going to go with concretion. What makes these Bosnian concretions so huge is still a mystery. Normandy, France is known as the site of the Great D-Day invasion of World War II. We know the Allied forces landed there, but do these photos prove a UFO did too? October 1989, Normandy, France. In the early morning hours, a man is trying to comfort his upset dog when suddenly he sees a large blue beam of light shoot up toward the sky in a nearby field. The following day, the owner of that field investigates and finds this. More than 50 feet of the field appears destroyed. The vegetation replaced by dark, spongy soil, sunken about 6 inches below the surrounding grass. French UFO researcher Baptiste Friscour says the strange sight becomes known as Le Trou Normand, which means the Norman Hole.
People at the time considered it mysterious because suddenly, after a huge light, a patch of grass was burned. So many thought it was a trace on the ground of a UFO landing.
It's easy to see why the theory caught on, considering the French Space Agency, CNES, had already investigated a similar case years earlier across the country in a town called Trans-en-Provence.
One of the most intriguing events in French UFO cases happened January 8, 1981 at 5 p.m. The witness hears a whistling. A craft rushes through the trees, lands 200 feet in front of him. Then the craft shoots up and circular traces are found on the ground.
A few days later, the space agency collected soil samples at the site, which suggested something heavy and perhaps very hot hit the ground there. So did a UFO land and take off? And did the same thing happen years later? In 2007, France became the first country to release all of its UFO files. This digital archive contains more than 1,000 UFO cases, including this one. Does that mean this is a true UFO? Not until our experts say so. First, could that flash of blue light that the eyewitness saw have come from a fire? Turns out there's a type of fire that can cause a pattern like this.
If you have very thick layers of organic material, let's say like in peat bogs or in in areas where you have a lot of dead vegetation, you can get these things called zombie fires.
Peat is a kind of soil containing partially decomposed plant material, making it rich in carbon and highly flammable.
The fires start, they literally burn along the bottom, and then it finally comes to a spot where it can open up to the surface and burn outwards.
But there's one problem with that theory. Zombie fires can smolder for months or even years and would have still been burning when people found it. So was it a fire that started in a different way?
Upon further investigation, there was a chemical analysis done of the soil and of the grasses in here. And guess what they found? They found a chemical signature of kerosene. And many aircraft at the time actually used kerosene as fuel. So it's possible that blue glow might have been aircraft dumping fuel.
But that kerosene signature could also be attributed to some local history.
This is really near the Normandy beachhead. And during World War II, there were a lot of tanks and vehicles driving in that area. So it would not surprise me to find a kerosene signature in the soil.
Our verdict? We're going with a kerosene fire, though the source of that kerosene is still up for debate. However, the Trans-en-Provence case continues to be unexplained, even by France's space agency. And we've only begun to scratch the surface of France's UFO files. Who knows what we'll find next? Map-making during the age of exploration was a feat of human ingenuity, tracing the known world just as the world was becoming known. But this map that we're about to show you is unlike any other. It could be hundreds of years ahead of its time and perhaps not even human in origin. 1929, Istanbul, Turkey. A German theologian named Gustav Deissmann is cataloging antiquities at the Topkapi Palace Library. While making his way through the material, he sees this. It's a faded map filled with detailed illustrations of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. At the bottom, there appears to be a landmass depicting Antarctica. But there's a problem. While Antarctica was first spotted by explorers in the 19th century, according to this text, this antique map is dated 1513. What's up with that?
Deissmann found this map, or the fragment of the map, and being able to read the script on it, he saw the name Piri Reis. Piri Reis was an important figure in Turkish naval history at that time because he had written a book called The Book of the Sea. He had written two different versions of it that are in different archives around the world.
The possibility that Reis mapped Antarctica some 300 years ahead of its reported discovery is already surprising. But one missing detail makes this depiction even more interesting.
There are some who believe the map depicts Antarctica without an ice cap. And if that's the case, that means it could be based on references that are at least 6,000 years old, when the ice cap of Antarctica was 160 miles away from where it currently is. If that's the case, it would also mean that it predates the oldest known map, the Imago Mundi, by thousands of years.
That's why some have suggested the map's true author wasn't Piri Reis at all, pointing to a design element of the map as evidence.
Some people think that this map is an example of the Mercator projection, a cartography technique that wouldn't actually be invented until later on in the 16th century.
Mercator projection gives modern maps their lines of longitude and latitude. The radial lines seen on the Piri Reis map are, for some, the fingerprints of the true mapmaker, someone ahead of their time and possibly out of this world.
Some people have taken that theory and run with it, posing that the Ottomans were actually in contact with aliens who gave them the details that they would need to create the map. Because, according to them, it's just too advanced for people of the 16th century to have created.
For years, the Vinland map was heralded as the earliest depiction of the New World, dating from the 15th century. But a recent analysis revealed it to be a fake, drawn up with 20th century ink. It's enough to have us asking if the Piri Reis map is everything that theorists claim. Let's ask our experts. First, we tackle the question of whether the true author of the map is extraterrestrial.
If this was something an alien had seen from above the air and was able to document it, I think it would be more accurately depicted. And what you see here is such a tiny fraction of what the whole of Antarctica looks like. There are other things about it that aren't correct, like North America. The Caribbean isn't exactly correct. I don't believe that this knowledge comes from anything extraterrestrial.
If aliens didn't have a hand in this map, what about its allegedly advanced use of Mercator projection?
That's not Mercator. It looks a bit like it, but this is instead what we call a Portolan map. Portolan means a port map. And the radial patterns we see are from a fixed point where boats would navigate to hit various ports.
But the appearance of Antarctica is at the dead center of all the questions about the Piri Reis map. So, what is it that we're looking at here?
Starting sometime in the 15th, 16th century, 17th century, there was more and more talk that there must be some other continent to the south of us. They called it Terra Australis. It was actually a concept that came all the way back from the Greeks. The Greeks also thought there must be some sort of continent down there, but enough people talked about it where people were putting it theoretically on maps.
The Terra Australis explanation also sheds light on why there's no ice cap on this map's Antarctica.
Some people suggested that it was a picture of Antarctica before it was iced over. And that's an interesting possibility, but we now have the technology to look under the ice and see where the actual landforms are. It is nothing like what's portrayed in this map.
Our verdict? We're looking at Terra Australis. This isn't the work of aliens, just an example of a skilled cartographer attempting to map out the unknown. And speaking of the unknown, what on earth is this thing right here? A dinosaur? A mythical sea creature? Maybe that's a mystery for another time. In a 2007 survey, 57% of Catholics, 66% of evangelicals, and 10% of Jews reported having a personal experience with a guardian angel. Could this next story be proof they really do exist? November 2008, Charlotte, North Carolina. Colleen Banton is at the bedside of her chronically ill 14-year-old daughter, Chelsea. Chelsea is battling severe pneumonia, and she's attached to a ventilator. Doctors have told Colleen they are running out of options. As Colleen prays, a nurse calls her attention to a nearby security monitor. And that's when Colleen sees something extraordinary on the screen. She takes out her camera and photographs the monitor, capturing this. A bright spot is flaring in front of the doors to the pediatric ICU. It resembles a human figure with wings.
I said, it looks like an angel, but I've never seen anything like this. I looked down the hall. I don't see it there. You could only see it in the TV monitor that was in there. So I was blown away. It stayed there for probably an hour or so.
Again, it's only visible on the computer screen, not the wall itself. Colleen calls what happened next with her daughter a miracle.
And when they took her off of the machine, all of her stats were perfect. She was fine. She didn't have to go back on the ventilator or anything. Even the doctor said, that's from that angel. That angel healed her.
And not just an angel, a guardian angel.
The idea that every person has their own specific guardian angel is a common Christian belief. The idea that there is one angel perhaps assigned to them to look out for them in times of need. In the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition, and even in the Islamic tradition in the Hadith, we see angels being created from light.
Stories within these religious traditions support Colleen's belief that a divine healing power saved her daughter.
We see stories of Jesus curing those people who are crippled, those people who are blind, and restoring them back to health. We see numerous stories of angels exhibiting their healing powers. For example, in the Gospel of John, we see the stirring of the pool of Bethesda. So healing miracles are prominent in the Bible. We have as many as 36 million hospital admissions a year, 140 million emergency room admissions. So it's not surprising that people of faith would assume that there would be angelic events happening in a hospital itself.
In a previous episode, we brought you the story of an alleged angel that saved a driver from a potentially horrific SUV crash. In that case, our experts were stumped. But what's going on here? Since this is an image of an image, is it possible that the light we're seeing is simply the flash from Colleen's camera?
It's definitely not. It's embedded within the display. You can see the lines of the monitor within that image, so this is definitely not a flash. There is something occurring within that space. There is something that the camera is seeing.
The big question is whether the source of this light is divine or not.
I can't confirm or deny what the source of that light is, but these doors appear to be ajar. Could they have influenced the light within that region to reflect or refract information up onto that corner to demonstrate the shape of something? There's a number of components that can result in error or create artifacts, and we see this a lot in surveillance technology.
Some surveillance cameras and digital sensors can see beyond the spectrum of light visible to the human eye. So it's possible that whatever's beaming into this space when the doors open might go unseen by people at the hospital. The source of the light remains unknown, but what's undeniable is the miraculous timing of Chelsea's recovery.
It's remarkable that so many things happened at exactly the right time. The fact that she didn't die, she came back. So the bottom line is, miracles can happen. They are rare, that's why they're called miracles. I think after everything is said and done, there's simply not enough data to make a definitive conclusion.
Our verdict, unexplained phenomenon. We may not have definitive proof about the source of that image, but we do have a story of miraculous recovery. Chelsea was able to make it home weeks after her mom took the picture, just in time for Christmas. She brought absolute joy to her family. But unfortunately, in the following years, her health issues got worse, and she passed away in 2015 at the age of 21. Did you know that our National Forest Service manages a whopping 193 million acres of land? That's almost 9% of the country. So is it really so hard to believe that Bigfoot could be living somewhere in there? April 28, 2009, we're in North Carolina's Uwharrie National Forest. Bigfoot researcher Mike Green has set up thermal imaging cameras to record through the evening. He says he's encountered Bigfoot in this forest before, and he's determined to capture it on film. After leaving the cameras unattended for a few hours, he returns to see that they've recorded this. The thermal imagery makes it hard to identify, but if we push in and enhance the footage, we can clearly see a large humanoid figure skulking between the trees. Green estimated the figure to be over 7.5 feet tall.
The technique of putting out a recorder or a camera and then leaving the area, it frankly makes a lot of sense. Sasquatches are paranoid enough, and if there's a person lurking around, they're going to be acting differently than they would if they were alone.
Then, nearly 10 years later, in 2018, another Bigfoot researcher, Matt Hooper of the Carolina Cryptid Field Research Team, set up audio equipment in the same forest.
I started hearing the stories of what other people were encountering out there. So I went out there for 5 days with a friend. I had my recorders going as usual.
And when Matt checks them the following morning, he captured a howl in the distance. Then another roar that seems to overlap with other howls. It's hard to hear, so we'll pump up the volume.
You can see it, the spikes on the waveform, and I think it's moving through the tree line.
Hooper wouldn't tell us where in the forest he recorded the sound, which is standard practice among Bigfoot researchers.
I don't share my best spots for the same reason I don't share my best fishing spots. I don't want people going in there and planting evidence and trying to hoax me.
Do these overlapping howls suggest multiple creatures, possibly staking claim to their territory? Stories from the past suggest that Sasquatch are indeed territorial. Take the case of Portlock, Alaska. The prime peninsula that was chock full of valuable game and shellfish was found mysteriously abandoned by the local natives, who told stories about people being torn apart by the Nantinuk, or hairy man. An attempt made in the 1920s to industrialize the area failed after continued disappearances and strange animal attacks prompted all the townsfolk to flee, leaving the area deserted to this very day.
Seeing one of these things must be horrifying, especially if it's chasing you out of an area. But I argue that these kinds of animals are not overtly aggressive because I think if they were out to get us, there'd be very few of us left.
Going back to that footage from 2009, Mike Green, the man who collected it, said whatever was in the video stole two things from his camp: a Zagnut candy bar and a squeaky toy that belonged to his grandchildren. This is why many people now call this the squeaky thermal. Could these recordings be proof that beasts are lurking somewhere within the Uwharrie National Forest? Let's talk to the experts. Let's start by taking a closer look at Mike Green's thermal video.
I am impressed by the shape of the head. It has a kind of receding brow to a high point posteriorly. That is a characteristic of hominoids. Lacking a large brain, they don't have the prominent forehead that a human skull would have.
Still, the image is too ambiguous to be convincing proof by itself. What about the audio recording?
There does not seem to be any edits or any discrepancies that would lead me to believe that there was anything tampered in the recording. It appears to be an authentic recording.
Many people thought these could just be coyotes, so we compare the sounds. It's not a coyote. Next, we compare the recording to the so-called Ohio howls, recorded in Columbiana County, Ohio in 1994. Some Bigfoot researchers consider it to be the genuine sound of a Bigfoot howling and disturbing local dogs.
The Ohio howls have this change of frequency. The sounds from the Uwharrie recording have a very constant frequency. They're from different sources.
So if that's not a match, then what are we hearing? Although the exact location of the recording is unknown, one clue might be an important landmark just several miles outside of the Uwharrie Forest. That's the North Carolina Zoo.
One of the questions would be, how far away from the zoo could it be if there isn't much wind? Probably we could hear a zoo animal perhaps up to half a mile away. So we don't have a way of knowing exactly what the sound source is here. This would be from some other origin, something worthy of investigation.
The sun hung low over the desolate expanse of the lunar surface, casting elongated shadows that seemed almost deliberate, as if the moon itself were observing the tiny human figures that dared to walk upon it. Astronauts Charles Duke and John Young maneuvered carefully in their cumbersome suits, each movement exaggerated by the reduced gravity, yet precise in execution, rehearsed countless times in simulators on Earth. The tranquility of the gray terrain was deceptive, a stark contrast to the undercurrent of tension and anticipation that had been building since the spacecraft's orbit insertion. Command modules and lunar rovers had long been cataloged in procedural logs as ordinary equipment, yet there was a palpable sense among the crew that the mission, ostensibly routine, might hold secrets even NASA had not anticipated revealing. As Young scanned the horizon through the helmet's visor, he thought he saw a shimmer, a flicker of movement that didn't belong to any known topographical feature. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a crater. It was small, metallic perhaps, glinting at an angle no natural lunar formation should catch the sunlight, and for a fleeting moment, the idea that they were not alone on the moon crystallized in his mind. Duke, on the other hand, seemed unconcerned at first, crouched over a set of soil samples, meticulously documenting each scoop, but when he finally looked up, his own eyes widened in an unspoken acknowledgement of the same phenomenon. They exchanged a brief, tense nod, their training kicking in even as curiosity gripped them. Observe first, speculate later. They approached cautiously, moving in deliberate, measured steps, the suit's hydraulics groaning softly in protest. The closer they got, the more the object revealed itself, a shape both familiar and alien, angular yet smooth, emitting a subtle luminescence that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of something alive, though nothing had yet moved. Duke extended a gloved hand, recording the readings on the portable instrument panel, the Geiger counter behaving erratically, spiking in ways the solar radiation and lunar environment could not account for. A low hum reverberated through the suit, so faint they might have imagined it, yet unmistakable in its persistence. Young, suppressing a surge of disbelief, crouched beside Duke, feeling the same tingle of unease as if static electricity were crawling along his skin beneath the protective layers of the suit. He adjusted the camera to focus on the object, capturing angles, reflections, surface texture, anything that could be reviewed later. The object remained motionless, almost imperceptibly suspended above the regolith, defying conventional explanations. Duke whispered, half to himself, half to Young, It's not supposed to be here." Young's reply was a measured, almost robotic, "We document. We report. That's the protocol." Yet even as he said it, the seed of doubt had taken root. How could something so clearly artificial exist here, in a place where no human hand had yet laid claim? The object seemed to react subtly to their presence, a slight tilt, a shimmering refraction that hinted at awareness, though the astronauts were careful not to anthropomorphize too quickly. Minutes stretched, the weight of silence pressing on them in the most profound way, when suddenly a ripple across the lunar dust caught Young's eye. The object shifted, not significantly, but enough to suggest intent. Duke's instrument panel lit up in a cascade of anomalous readings, radiation levels spiking, magnetic fields warping, electronics flickering. A bead of sweat, impossible in the moon's gravity, seemed to trickle down Young's temple inside the helmet, the combination of tension and adrenaline creating a sensation he could almost feel. "We need to step back," he said, voice low but firm, the words swallowed by the calm static. Duke nodded, but as he moved, the object emitted a pulse, a soft flare of light that enveloped them briefly in an eerie glow. The suit's temperature. Regulators kicked in, alarms chiming in protest as localized heating occurred without apparent source. The radiation spikes were brief but significant, enough to make Young's stomach twist with an instinctive fear he struggled to mask. Back in the command module, Ken Mattingly monitored telemetry with a mixture of pride and unease. The readings were beyond anything previously encountered: electromagnetic anomalies, unexplainable radiation bursts, slight deviations in gravitational modeling. He typed furiously into the console, noting the erratic behavior, but a nagging thought gnawed at him. This wasn't in the manual. NASA's official directives could not account for what the Apollo 16 astronauts were witnessing firsthand. Meanwhile, Duke and Young maintained composure outwardly, documenting, measuring, recording, while internally wrestling with the overwhelming improbability of their situation. The object hovered silently, almost patiently, as if aware that its presence was being scrutinized. Time became fluid. Minutes stretched into a surreal continuum where logic and imagination blurred. The astronauts debated, silently, whether to retrieve samples nearby or retreat to the rover. Every instinct screamed caution, but curiosity and the burden of duty created a tension almost unbearable. Young finally decided on a compromise: collect a few additional regolith samples at the edge of the anomaly, maintaining a safe distance. Duke complied, carefully scooping and sealing the lunar dust, the instruments continuing to register unexplained fluxes. The object seemed indifferent to these movements, maintaining its subtle undulations of light. As the collection completed, Duke felt a tingling in his fingers through the gloves, a sensation he couldn't explain. Young noticed the same on his arm. "Radiation readings," he murmured, more to confirm to himself than to Duke, though Duke's expression mirrored the realization. They retreated to the rover, cautiously maintaining eye contact with the object, now hovering slightly higher, as if watching them. The drive back to the lunar module was tense but uneventful, the object remaining stationary, enigmatic, yet impossibly present. Once inside the module, the crew checked systems, suits, oxygen levels, comms, everything nominal except for lingering radiation indicators. Duke rubbed at his forearm through the suit material, feeling a faint warmth that persisted despite life support systems regulating ambient temperature. "We're going to need to run full decontamination once we're back," Young said, though the words carried a weight beyond standard procedure. They re-entered the command module for the trip home, the object remaining in their final visual range until lunar orbit swallowed it from view. Days later, on Earth, the narrative would be sanitized, technical reports indicating unexplained anomalies without sensational detail. Yet privately, the crew shared the same unease. Something had been there, something that defied understanding. Duke noticed subtle reddening of the skin, almost sunburn-like, though the decontamination had been thorough. Young experienced similar symptoms, minor at first, then growing more pronounced, tingling, slight peeling, a persistent itch that defied topical remedies. Medical officers speculated on cosmic radiation exposure, though levels recorded should not have produced such effects. Privately, Young began journaling observations not included in mission reports, careful to note patterns in the anomalies and their temporal relationship to the UFO encounter. He speculated that the object's proximity had amplified radiation in ways conventional physics could not explain, perhaps utilizing mechanisms unknown to humanity. The sensation wasn't merely physical. There was an insidious psychological imprint, subtle shifts in perception, fleeting glimpses of shapes in peripheral vision, a sense that reality had momentarily warped. Duke, less meticulous but equally observant, corroborated these effects, noting them in private logs, his handwriting hurried, anxious. The media would later cover the mission's scientific success, lunar soil analysis, photography of craters and formations. Few would question what had not been documented officially. Yet for those present, the experience was indelible, a scar both tangible and psychic. Over the following weeks, the astronauts communicated cautiously with mission control, observing subtle changes in instrumentation, the lingering radiation markers on suits, and even post-mission experiments hinting at residual energy patterns that defied categorization. The incident would remain largely classified, filtered through layers of bureaucracy, deemed unfit for public consumption, lest panic or speculation undermine institutional authority. But for Duke and Young, the memory persisted, vivid and persistent. Dreams carried the same hovering metallic form, pulses of light synchronized with heartbeats, shadows elongating impossibly, lunar dust moving without physical cause. In these dreams, the moon became a liminal space, a stage for encounters where human perception was stretched to its limits, where the line between the real and the inexplicable blurred. Months later, Young would review mission footage, frame by frame, finding subtle anomalies, brief flashes of light that seemed purposeful, reflections on the lunar surface inconsistent with any known celestial or artificial source. Duke, too, found small, inexplicable distortions in sample photographs, slight magnetic interference in equipment logs, patterns suggesting an intelligence they could not quantify. The astronauts began a private dialogue about their experience, speculative yet precise, weighing the ethical implications of disclosure against personal and professional responsibility. They considered that humanity might not be ready, that revelation could trigger hysteria or worse, yet suppression gnawed at their conscience. Scientific curiosity collided with institutional caution, leaving them in a liminal moral state, balancing truth against consequences. The physical symptoms persisted faintly, slight skin reddening, moments of vertigo, subtle thermal discomfort, yet nothing overtly threatening. Psychologically, however, the impact was profound, awareness that the universe might harbor intelligence far beyond terrestrial comprehension, that space travel carried risks unaccounted for in manuals and protocols, that human understanding of physics and life itself might be fundamentally incomplete. In private, both kept meticulous logs, documenting anomalies, environmental readings, and personal experiences, creating a compendium of data that could, in theory, formed the foundation for future inquiry. Yet they also recognized that without corroborating evidence, without official sanction, these notes were personal relics, fragile against institutional scrutiny. This duality, between official report and lived experience, formed the core tension of their post-mission lives, coloring interactions with colleagues, the media, and even family. Every lunar photograph, every soil sample, became a reminder not merely of achievement, but of an encounter that defied rational explanation. And so, the first part of this journey concluded not with closure, but with a lingering, unsettling question. What truly hovers just beyond perception, in the desolate spaces we dare to explore, waiting silently for eyes willing to see, yet resistant to comprehension? The weeks after the lunar mission became a peculiar mixture of mundane routine and obsessive reflection for Charles Duke and John Young. Despite their public appearances and ceremonial honors, a private tension lingered, one they shared silently through cryptic exchanges and careful glances. In the quiet hours of the night, when sleep was elusive, Young would pore over the mission's telemetry, analyzing frame by frame the subtle anomalies he had glimpsed in lunar surface images. There was a pattern, he realized, though frustratingly faint and inconsistent. A shimmer in the corner of the camera lens, a flicker of light moving against the expected angles of sunlight, a reflection that seemed too deliberate to be a natural artifact. Duke, equally unable to rest, meticulously revisited his soil samples, running tests that went beyond official protocols, employing instruments he had smuggled from the lab under the guise of routine maintenance checks. Their private investigations converged on a single, unnerving hypothesis. The object they had seen, and which had been clearly present in orbit, had left a trace of influence that was measurable, albeit subtly, across multiple dimensions of the mission's data. Both men felt the unspoken implication. They had encountered something intelligent, something that was monitoring them in ways that science could only begin to describe. Young's dreams became increasingly vivid and intrusive. The metallic object of the moon appeared repeatedly, sometimes hovering directly over the lunar module, sometimes drifting across the horizon as if it were both near and impossibly distant. These dreams carried sensory details, a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate not only in the ears but in the chest cavity, faint warmth against the skin despite the moon's extreme cold, and a peculiar sense of anticipation, almost like an unspoken message trying to form. Duke, on the other hand, was haunted by tactile sensations. Occasionally, while handling lunar samples or reviewing photographs, he felt a subtle tingling on his skin, a phantom heat along his arms, the faintest redness resembling a burn. Medical analysis had been inconclusive, suggesting minor radiation exposure, but nothing consistent with the symptoms. Yet the recurrence was undeniable. It was as if the encounter had left an imprint, a residual energy that defied explanation. They began meeting discreetly, outside of formal debriefings, to compare observations. In a windowless room at NASA, filled with buzzing fluorescent lights, the two men would lay out soil samples, maps, and photographic slides, pointing to anomalies too subtle to appear in official reports. They spoke in hushed tones, acutely aware that any record of these discussions could trigger censorship or, worse, professional repercussions. "It reacts," Young said one evening, eyes fixed on a slide that revealed a faint, geometrically improbable reflection along the lunar regolith. Not like an object reacting to us physically, but somehow energetically. Something beyond our instruments, or maybe using our instruments as a medium. Duke nodded, tracing a finger along a micro crack in a lunar rock sample that seemed unnaturally linear. And the skin, the warmth, the burn. It's not solar radiation. It's something else. Something targeted or residual from its presence. They considered the possibility that the object had emitted a type of radiation or field that lingered even after their departure, leaving traces in matter and human tissue alike. The notion was uncomfortable, but increasingly difficult to dismiss. Their research led them to old mission logs, data from Apollo 14 and 15, searching for precedents. There were references to unexplained anomalies, brief flashes of light, transient instrument malfunctions, and astronaut reports of strange atmospheric phenomena, usually discounted as cosmic ray interference. They began cross-referencing dates and lunar coordinates, constructing a map of occurrences that suggested the presence of similar objects or events over multiple missions. Patterns emerged, almost invisible but persistent. Young began to speculate privately that the object could be part of a systematic surveillance network, not merely a chance encounter. Duke, more cautious but no less intrigued, considered the possibility of residual effects, energetic footprints left behind deliberately or incidentally. This implied a level of technological sophistication that far exceeded human capability at the time. Outside the confines of NASA, their personal lives began to reflect the intrusion of the lunar encounter. Young noticed subtle changes in perception, shadows moving against expectation, lights in the corner of his eyes that vanished when directly observed, and an increasing sensitivity to electromagnetic fields in everyday electronics. Duke found that conventional instruments sometimes registered brief spikes in localized radiation in his home or laboratory, coinciding with no discernible source. Friends and family attributed these reactions to stress or post-mission anxiety, but both men knew otherwise. They had touched something unearthly. One evening, as the two reviewed data together in the quiet of Duke's home office, Young's eyes caught a peculiar anomaly on a photograph he had taken from lunar orbit. A reflective shape, almost circular, appeared to hover over the Descartes Highlands. Duke leaned closer, adjusting the magnification. The reflection was subtle, not directly captured but suggested by a distortion of the surrounding regolith, a halo effect, almost imperceptible. Neither had noticed it in the initial analysis, yet now it felt undeniable. "It's like it's observing through the frame itself," Young whispered, the room silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Duke's hand hovered over the slide. "Or it's leaving a mark for us to find," he said slowly, almost reluctantly. This idea, that the object had an intentionality directed at them, chilled both men. It implied not only intelligence, but a sophisticated understanding of their instruments and perceptions. They debated whether this residual trace could be harnessed or studied without risk. In private, Young began constructing simulations, attempting to replicate the electromagnetic and photonic anomalies, seeking a model that could explain the observations within known physics. Duke focused on the physical samples, measuring thermal conductivity, magnetic susceptibility, and minute structural deformations. Both approaches were painstaking, meticulous, and frustratingly inconclusive. Every tentative breakthrough only deepened the mystery. The media coverage of Apollo 16 continued, lauding scientific achievements while glossing over the anomalies. Press briefings were carefully controlled, and questions about unexplained phenomena were deflected. Public fascination with UFOs and extraterrestrial life was high, yet official channels remained committed to silence. The astronauts themselves learned to navigate dual realities. Publicly, the celebrated heroes of lunar exploration; privately, custodians of an encounter that might alter humanity's understanding of life and intelligence in the cosmos. Months passed, and subtle physical symptoms persisted. The faint burns and tingling continued, most noticeable when the men were alone or working with the lunar samples. Young speculated that the object had emitted radiation in a form not fully understood, interacting uniquely with human tissue. Duke considered environmental factors, microparticles, or residual energy embedded in the regolith, perhaps transferred to the astronauts during the EVA. They both documented their experiences carefully, aware that even the mildest symptom could provide a clue to the nature of the encounter. One night, Young awoke from a vivid dream in which the moon's surface shifted, revealing a hidden structure partially buried in the regolith. He saw a corridor of metallic panels reflecting the sunlight in impossible angles, an interior space that seemed alive, pulsing with light in synchronization with his heartbeat. Duke, across town, experienced a similar vision, a metallic orb hovering above the lunar module, rotating slowly, radiating warmth that seeped into his suit even in his dream. Both men recorded these experiences, wondering if they were purely subconscious projections or somehow extensions of the object's lingering influence. The tension between scientific rigor and personal experience deepened. They feared overreach, yet the urge to understand was irresistible. Young began correlating dream events with anomalies in mission data, noting striking coincidences, the shimmer in a photographic frame appearing on nights of intense dreaming, slight variations in sample composition aligning with specific time frames. Duke explored whether prolonged exposure to these traces might yield more information, always mindful of health risks. They communicated carefully with each other, using coded references and logs to avoid scrutiny, sharing observations while maintaining plausible deniability. Meanwhile, pressure from NASA to standardize reporting and conclude post-mission studies intensified. Official investigations demanded results, timelines, and verified anomalies. Yet both men were aware that their most important findings could not be disclosed without triggering controversy. The delicate balance between compliance and truth became a psychological burden. Personal relationships began to feel strained. Friends and colleagues noticed changes in mood, subtle irritability, and periods of intense withdrawal. Both men were acutely aware that any disclosure could end careers or invite public scrutiny they were unprepared to face. Yet the lure of understanding the unknown outweighed the desire for conventional normalcy. As spring turned to summer, the subtle anomalies began to manifest in new ways. Electromagnetic devices near the lunar samples flickered unpredictably. Minor burns and tingling intensified in brief episodes. Even during routine communications with NASA, both men experienced fleeting perceptual distortions, voices seeming to echo strangely, instruments displaying numbers out of sequence, brief flashes of light in peripheral vision. These occurrences, though brief, reinforced the sense that the encounter had lasting, possibly ongoing consequences. One afternoon, while Young ran spectral analysis on a soil sample, the instrument detected a sudden spike in gamma radiation, far exceeding expected values. Duke, observing from across the lab, saw the spike mirrored in his equipment. The synchronicity was impossible under conventional explanations. Both men exchanged a long, unspoken glance. It was happening again. The residual energy, the influence of the object, not confined to the moon but extending, perhaps, across time and space to reach them here on Earth. They understood that they had crossed a threshold. The encounter was not merely historical, it was active. And as the sun set beyond the laboratory windows, casting long shadows across charts and photographs, they felt an almost tangible presence, a silent awareness of something intelligent observing, perhaps judging, their every move, every attempt to understand. A profound realization settled over them. Whatever they had encountered was not inert, not distant, but persistent, patient, and far beyond human comprehension. It waited, and the question that would haunt them for the rest of their lives loomed large. Were they studying the object, or was the object studying them? The passage of months only deepened the unnerving persistence of the anomalies Charles Duke and John Young experienced after Apollo 16. The physical traces, burn-like sensations, tingling along the arms, and occasional warmth emanating from areas that should have remained inert, persisted, sometimes subtle, sometimes acute, as if the memory of the lunar encounter had been etched into their very physiology. Nights became battlegrounds of sleep and wakefulness. Dreams and visions increasingly encroached upon reality, blending lines between perception and experience in ways neither astronaut had anticipated. Young, ever methodical, began keeping a dedicated journal, cataloging every symptom, every dream, every inexplicable anomaly in the equipment, trying to establish a sequence or a causal pattern. The dreams were particularly disquieting. He often found himself back on the moon, yet not as it had appeared during the mission. Craters shifted inexplicably, shadows elongated impossibly, and the metallic object, always the same, hovered silently, observing, pulsing, and sometimes moving with deliberate intention. On some nights, the object seemed to project a faint glow across the lunar surface that traced paths leading to terrain Duke and Young had not explored. In one recurring vision, corridors of light extended into the lunar regolith itself, forming a network of invisible architecture, a city hidden beneath the surface, its purpose inscrutable yet compelling in the eerie precision of its design. Duke, more tactile in his approach, began experimenting with the lunar samples under increasingly varied conditions. He exposed them to magnetic fields, lasers, and controlled radiation to test for any residual energy, structural anomalies, or unusual responses. To his astonishment, Certain samples exhibited minute movements under controlled magnetic pulses, subtle enough to escape detection without painstaking observation, yet undeniable. He documented these with high-speed cameras and precise instruments, aware that if peer-reviewed, such findings would incite both awe and disbelief. The lingering radiation readings puzzled them. Conventional physics could not account for spikes appearing in the very laboratory they used, especially those synchronized between the two men's respective workspaces. Young hypothesized that the object's influence was not strictly local. It had extended across space and time to imprint itself upon them, or perhaps upon the matter they carried from the moon. Such a hypothesis seemed impossible, yet the data, impossibly consistent, yet inexplicable, forced them to consider it seriously. Attempts at formal communication with NASA were frustrating. Engineers, medical officers, and mission scientists responded with standard explanations: cosmic radiation exposure, psychological stress, instrumentation error. No one could reconcile the anomalies with the reported data, and Young and Duke, aware of their professional limitations, realized they were alone in confronting the phenomena. Public appearances, media interviews, and lectures offered no relief. Each event served as a reminder that the world saw them as heroes of science and exploration, unaware of the lingering enigma tethered to their bodies and instruments. The dichotomy between their private experience and public narrative became increasingly pronounced, creating an internal tension that neither man could escape. One evening, Duke detected an unusual fluctuation in the laboratory's electromagnetic field, coinciding precisely with Young's observation of an anomaly in a lunar sample. It was subtle, a slight interference in a measurement device, but unmistakable in its timing. They exchanged a series of encoded messages, hesitant to discuss the matter over official channels, confirming independently that the anomaly had occurred simultaneously. This synchronicity suggested intentionality, a possibility that both thrilled and terrified them. The idea that the object was aware of their actions and capable of influencing events remotely introduced profound implications. Young began theorizing that the object might possess a form of intelligence incomprehensible to humans, one that could manipulate energy and matter at scales beyond conventional physics. Duke's experiments reinforced this hypothesis, demonstrating that the lunar samples contained energy patterns that could respond predictably to specific stimuli, as if encoding information in ways their instruments could partially decode. They also noticed a subtle psychological effect. Concentration became more difficult in the presence of the samples at certain times. A sense of awareness, almost like being observed, pervaded their mental state. This heightened vigilance sometimes resulted in physiological changes: rapid heartbeat, dry mouth, heightened reflexes. It was as if the presence of the object or its residual energy extended beyond the tangible, influencing not only the physical environment, but also the observer's cognitive and sensory responses. In a moment of quiet reflection, Young hypothesized that these effects might be intentional, part of an experiment conducted by an intelligence far older and more capable than humanity. Duke, normally pragmatic and grounded, found himself unerringly receptive to the idea. Their conversations took on a philosophical tone, exploring the ethics and consequences of discovery. Was it their responsibility to disclose these findings, knowing the potential for societal upheaval? Or was silence necessary, preserving humanity's current understanding until comprehension caught up with revelation? The psychological strain grew. Both men experienced heightened vigilance, occasional irritability, and persistent anxiety during interactions with colleagues. Social relationships frayed under the weight of secrecy and the burden of shared knowledge. Yet the scientific curiosity, driven by the possibility of understanding an intelligence far beyond human comprehension, remained irresistible. The astronauts began constructing a timeline correlating anomalies, physical symptoms, dream sequences, lunar sample reactions, and electromagnetic disturbances. Patterns emerged, almost imperceptibly, suggesting that the object was not passive but engaged in a form of observation, testing, or communication. On multiple occasions, devices unrelated to the lunar mission, located in separate rooms or buildings, registered coincident anomalies. These phenomena reinforced the notion that the object's influence was not bound by conventional spatial constraints, a realization both fascinating and terrifying. In private discourse, Duke suggested that the moon itself might act as a medium, a relay for energy or information, and that the object's presence had temporarily transformed the astronauts into vectors for its subtle activity. Young considered the implications for human physiology and consciousness, hypothesizing that the object could be capable of interacting directly with neural processes or sensory perception, leaving an imprint on memory and experience. As they continued, both men experienced escalating symptoms. The tingling evolved into mild, burning sensations, redness along the skin that persisted longer after contact with lunar samples, and a faint but persistent fatigue unrelieved by rest. Instruments began showing intermittent spikes when they were alone, but stabilized in the presence of others, as if the anomaly responded differently based on observation. They recognized an unsettling possibility. The object, or its residual energy, was aware of their attention, adjusting or modulating its effects in real time. Dreams escalated into quasi-lucid experiences. Young frequently found himself back on the lunar surface, but the terrain shifted in impossible ways, revealing patterns, structures, and objects never observed during the mission. These visions suggested an environment governed by rules that blended physics with an enigmatic intelligence, creating a scenario that defied conventional understanding. Duke's experiences mirrored this. He sometimes perceived corridors of light extending beneath the lunar surface, pathways that seemed to react to his presence. Often, he would awaken with a faint glow in his bedroom or laboratory, inexplicable but distinct, persisting for several minutes before dissipating. These events fostered both fascination and fear. They reinforced the notion that the encounter was not confined to the moon, not limited to their physical proximity, and that the object, or its influence, continued to engage with them intentionally. Scientific analysis became increasingly experimental. Young attempted to simulate electromagnetic anomalies observed in the samples, constructing controlled experiments that manipulated energy fields and photon exposure. Duke applied thermal, magnetic, and optical stimuli to the lunar dust, recording minuscule reactions with ultra-sensitive instruments. Results were subtle but consistent. Certain stimuli triggered predictable responses, as if the matter retained a form of memory or coding left by the object. The ethical dimension became unavoidable. Should they pursue research that might involve risk to themselves or the broader public if replicated or disclosed? Young argued for meticulous documentation and confidentiality. Duke advocated caution and the careful preservation of evidence for future study. Both recognized that the encounter, if confirmed publicly, could redefine humanity's understanding of life, intelligence, and the cosmos. In parallel, subtle external signals persisted. Occasionally, radio and communication devices would register brief static patterns resembling pulse sequences. They appeared too structured to be random noise, yet decoding efforts yielded no definitive interpretation. The coincidence of these signals with anomalies in their experiments suggested a form of communication or interaction, though its purpose remained opaque. Each observation, each experiment, reinforced the realization that they had not merely observed a phenomenon, but had been participants in an encounter with an intelligence capable of interacting across distances, across matter, and potentially across consciousness. The psychological weight intensified. Both men found themselves alternating between exhilaration and anxiety, fascination and dread. Sleep was fragmented, attention became hypervigilant, and the boundary between subjective experience and objective observation blurred further. They shared their findings cautiously, documenting in private logs, cross-referencing observations, and maintaining independent verification to minimize error. Yet the anomaly seemed aware, responsive, and in some incomprehensible way, deliberate. As months became years, Duke and Young's lives remained outwardly exemplary, yet privately intertwined with an encounter that refused to fade. The lunar mission, initially a triumph of exploration and human ingenuity, had transformed into an ongoing study of an entity beyond comprehension, one that persisted in subtle yet undeniable ways. The object's influence pervaded their instruments, their physiology, and their perception, leaving questions without answers and challenges without precedent. They had glimpsed, however fleetingly, a truth that transcended human understanding. The universe was far larger, stranger, and more intelligent than earthly science had ever conceived, and the astronauts of Apollo 16 were now custodians of a secret that could redefine the very meaning of human exploration and awareness. And so, despite the passage of time, despite official accolades and ceremonial praise, the two men remained haunted, vigilant, and ever curious, aware that their journey had only just begun, that the proof, subtle, pervasive, and elusive, was indeed out there, waiting for those willing to see beyond the limits of accepted reality. By the time summer faded into autumn, the subtle yet persistent effects of the lunar encounter had transformed into a daily preoccupation for Charles Duke and John Young. The lingering burns, tingling sensations, and occasional surges of unexplained warmth became almost a rhythm of life, a reminder that the moon had left an indelible imprint on their bodies and minds. In laboratories, offices, and even their homes, instruments began responding in ways that defied traditional physics, registering anomalies in magnetic fields, electromagnetic interference, and even light refraction that appeared only in their presence. Young's meticulous journaling became obsessive, cataloging every flicker, pulse, and temperature fluctuation, correlating them with sleep patterns, lunar sample manipulations, and even subtle environmental changes such as barometric pressure, humidity, and solar activity. Duke, more tactile and intuitive, continued his hands-on experiments with lunar regolith, observing slight movements under energy exposure, small thermal responses, and structural deformations that suggested an invisible intelligence interacting with the material. The two men began meeting more frequently in secluded spaces, comparing observations, hypothesizing interactions, and testing variables in increasingly controlled conditions. They developed a private protocol for experimentation, one conducted while alone, another under simultaneous observation, a third during periods of sleep, and yet another when utilizing electromagnetic shielding. Results, invariably subtle yet consistent, suggested not random anomaly but intentional influence, as though the object, or its residual energy, was responsive, adaptive, and capable of remote observation. Dreams, once episodic, intensified into vivid simulations of lunar environments, sometimes entirely constructed and other times intertwined with real mission footage. Young frequently dreamt of the metallic object hovering above newly discovered terrain, its light pulsing in patterns that seemed almost communicative. Duke's dreams involved corridors of light within the regolith, moving and reshaping in response to his approach, as if the lunar surface itself had become a dynamic interface between reality and perception. Both men speculated on the object's motives, its intelligence, and the scope of its awareness. The notion that the object might intentionally leave subtle breadcrumbs for humans to discover emerged from these investigations. Could the anomalies in instrumentation, radiation, and perception be a form of contact, testing human capacity for observation, or something more profound? Public life continued to mask their private reality. Apollo 16 remained celebrated as a pinnacle of human achievement, yet the official narrative avoided anomalies, UFO sightings, or unexplained data, relegating such details to the margins of classified reports. Colleagues, journalists, and audiences lauded their professionalism, unaware that the two astronauts were living with experiences that challenged the very foundations of science. Yet the dual existence, the public hero and private observer, was psychologically taxing. Hypervigilance became routine. Both men noted instances of heightened sensory awareness, fleeting glimpses in peripheral vision, and a sense of presence that seemed intelligent and intentional. Environmental factors, simple electrical devices, cameras, even lights, exhibited subtle but measurable disturbances, often correlating with the intensity of observation or the proximity of lunar samples. In one remarkable episode, Duke and Young coordinated a set of experiments across separate locations. Instruments were synchronized to measure electromagnetic flux, thermal deviations, and minor radiation bursts, while both men were alone in their respective labs. The results were astonishing. Simultaneous anomalies occurred in both locations with a statistical improbability beyond any conventional explanation. The synchronicity implied an influence that transcended space, suggesting either a previously unknown physical phenomenon or an intelligent agency capable of orchestrating complex events remotely. This realization deepened the psychological weight. Both men acknowledged that the object's influence was not confined to the moon, the samples, or even Earth itself, but operated along parameters they could barely begin to comprehend. They also noted subtle changes in cognition, brief lapses in concentration during experimentation, heightened emotional sensitivity, and fleeting perceptual distortions resembling the fleeting shimmer of the lunar object's light. Such phenomena were transient yet undeniable, reinforcing the notion of an ongoing, intentional presence. As the months passed, Duke and Young began experimenting with communication attempts. They used controlled electromagnetic pulses, photonic signaling with lasers, and subtle manipulations of environmental energy, seeking a pattern or response. While results were inconclusive in terms of deliberate messaging, minor alterations in instrumentation coincided with specific experimental protocols, suggesting either interaction or monitoring. At the same time, both men experienced heightened physiological effects. Tingling evolved into persistent, mild burning sensations. Slight skin redness and warmth recurred unpredictably. Sleep became fragmented, sometimes dominated by vivid, semi-lucid dreams in which lunar surfaces morphed, the object moved with intention, and pathways of light suggested complexity and intelligence far beyond human understanding. The astronauts speculated that these experiences might represent a dual interaction, one tangible, measurable in matter and energy, and the other cognitive, influencing perception and awareness. They documented dreams with unprecedented precision, cross-referencing details with experimental anomalies and lunar footage. Occasionally, encoded patterns seemed to emerge, subtle sequences in light reflection on the lunar regolith, minor electromagnetic pulses in instruments, and fluctuations in energy levels corresponding to dream events. While speculative, the correlation suggested intentionality, reinforcing their sense of participation in an ongoing phenomenon rather than passive observation. The ethical dimension of disclosure loomed large. Any public acknowledgement of these anomalies risked career termination, institutional backlash, or public panic. Yet the imperative to understand, to study, and to document the experience pressed relentlessly. Duke and Young carefully maintained logs, coding sensitive information, and preserving independent verification to withstand scrutiny. Small, external signals continued to manifest unpredictably, brief bursts in radio communications, interference in video equipment, and transient magnetic anomalies. Although subtle, their occurrence in coordination with experimental protocols and observation suggested non-random origin. The implications were staggering. If these signals were connected to the object, then the influence extended not only across matter, but across perception and cognition, a level of interaction that human science could barely theorize. Simultaneously, subtle psychological effects persisted. Both men reported fleeting sensations of presence, heightened emotional sensitivity, and an uncanny ability to perceive anomalies in instrumentation before measurement confirmed them. These effects, transient yet recurring, reinforced the notion of a persistent intelligence, one that engaged with them through multiple channels, both physical and cognitive. As the following year approached, Young proposed a radical hypothesis. The object, or its residual influence, might be attempting to communicate through indirect means, using the environment, instruments, and perception itself as a medium. Duke, initially skeptical, observed corresponding anomalies in his experiments and began to consider the possibility seriously. Together, they designed a controlled series of tests intended to elicit structured responses, laser pulses directed at the lunar samples, modulated electromagnetic fields, and specific patterns of observation repeated with meticulous precision. Preliminary results were tantalizing. Slight alterations in energy readings corresponded with the timing of interventions, but unpredictably, and often only partially. These effects were subtle enough to avoid confirmation by standard instruments, yet consistent when documented meticulously over extended periods. The dual nature of their experience, observable, measurable anomalies on one hand and cognitive, perceptual effects on the other, posed an unprecedented challenge. They were scientists trained to separate subjectivity from objectivity, yet the phenomenon resisted such categorization. It was as if the object, or its residual energy, existed simultaneously in multiple domains: physical, informational, and psychological. The personal impact deepened. Both men found themselves increasingly isolated from casual colleagues and friends, bound by the secret that could neither be revealed nor fully explained. Social interaction was tinged with heightened awareness, a subconscious scanning for anomalies or signs of influence, leaving them subtly alienated. Dreams grew more structured, sometimes resembling navigable lunar landscapes with corridors of light, reflective surfaces, and hovering metallic shapes. These visions occasionally included interactions, not direct communication, but subtle cues suggesting observation, testing, or guidance. By correlating these dreams with anomalies in instrumentation and sample behavior, Duke and Young began forming a model, tentative, speculative, and incomplete, of the object's influence, a networked, intelligent presence capable of affecting matter, energy, and consciousness across spatial and temporal boundaries. Awareness of these patterns was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. The object's intelligence appeared both patient and deliberate, challenging conventional understanding of physics, cognition, and life itself. The line between observer and observed became increasingly ambiguous, leaving both men to grapple with profound questions about agency, intention, and the nature of reality. And yet, despite the uncertainty, they continued, recording, experimenting, theorizing, and observing. The Apollo 16 mission, celebrated publicly as a triumph of exploration, had, in private, transformed into an ongoing study of an intelligence beyond comprehension. The astronauts were no longer merely travelers or scientists. They had become participants in a phenomenon whose scope, purpose, and origin remained elusive. Each day, each experiment, each dream added fragments to a mosaic they could never fully complete, yet could not abandon. The proof, they realized, was indeed out there, lingering invisibly, subtly, persistently, waiting for those who could see beyond the limits of conventional reality, challenging humanity to expand its understanding and reminding Duke and Young that their journey, far from complete, had only just begun. As the years passed, the subtleties of the lunar encounter became both a burden and a compulsion for Charles Duke and John Young. Though publicly celebrated as heroes of Apollo 16, privately they navigated a landscape far more intricate, one shaped by lingering anomalies and unexplained phenomena. Every interaction with the lunar samples, every glance at mission photographs, every adjustment of instruments seemed to trigger subtle reactions, as if the metallic object they had observed hovering over the moon was still present, now influencing life on Earth in ways that science could barely measure. Young, meticulous and analytical, established a personal laboratory at home, a sanctuary where he could observe, measure, and document without interruption. It became a ritual, hours of exposure to the lunar regolith, testing with light, heat, and electromagnetic fields, recording results in painstaking detail, while cross-referencing with anomalies in instrumentation, environmental readings, and physiological responses. Duke, more tactile and experimental, took to recreating lunar conditions as best he could on Earth, simulating low gravity with mechanical devices, exposing samples to varied energies, and measuring reactions with the most sensitive equipment he could access. Both men discovered patterns. Subtle fluctuations in energy readings coincided with moments of direct observation, slight alterations in dream sequences correlated with instrument anomalies, and the residual warmth and tingling in their skin seemed synchronized with particular experiments. It became increasingly evident that the object's influence was multidimensional, physical, informational, and cognitive. It responded to attention, observation, and manipulation. Dreams intensified into a hybrid of memory, simulation, and interaction. Young found himself back on the moon, not as it had appeared during the mission, but as a dynamic, shifting environment, populated by corridors of reflective light and objects that defied description. Occasionally, the metallic object appeared to move in deliberate patterns, responding to his gaze, sometimes pulsing with light synchronized to his heartbeat. Duke's dreams mirrored this, with the lunar surface shifting under his feet, pathways of energy forming patterns, subtle cues suggesting intelligence and intention. The astronauts began experimenting with attempts at communication, subtle and indirect. Young used lasers modulated in specific sequences, photonic pulses designed to stimulate reactions, and controlled electromagnetic fields to interact with the samples. Duke manipulated thermal, magnetic, and optical stimuli to test for responsiveness. Minor anomalies occurred in response, often inconsistent but perceptible, suggesting a level of engagement, as if the object, or its residual influence, was monitoring, evaluating, or guiding. The physical effects persisted. Tingling and mild burns flared unpredictably, often coinciding with periods of intense observation or experimental activity. Both men noted that certain lunar samples seemed to retain or amplify these sensations, behaving as if they had been imprinted with an energy pattern that interacted with human physiology. The possibility that the object had left an indelible mark on matter and life became increasingly difficult to ignore. Psychological effects deepened. Hypervigilance, brief lapses in concentration, subtle perceptual distortions, and moments of heightened awareness became commonplace. Both men sensed presence, an awareness that transcended the limits of conventional perception. At times, fleeting shapes or light movements appeared in peripheral vision. At other times, instruments registered anomalies in synchronization with their mental focus. They began to speculate that the object's intelligence operated not only through energy and matter, but also through cognition, influencing perception in ways that were subtle yet undeniable. Social life became increasingly constrained. Both men struggled with isolation, maintaining public personas while privately grappling with phenomena that could neither be explained nor safely disclosed. Communication with colleagues was careful and coded, avoiding mention of residual effects, while logs and experimental notes were meticulously encrypted or hidden. Yet the compulsion to understand was irresistible. They realized that they were not merely studying the object. They were participants in an ongoing interaction with an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. On particularly vivid nights, their dreams revealed landscapes of impossible geometry, shifting lunar horizons, and corridors of radiant light. In these dreamscapes, the object displayed behaviors suggesting awareness, strategy, or even playfulness. It would hover just out of reach, shift patterns when observed, and emit pulses that seemed designed to provoke curiosity or reaction. Such experiences were as much psychological as physical, leaving lasting impressions upon waking. Anomalies in instruments continued to reinforce these perceptions. Synchronized spikes in electromagnetic fields, radiation fluctuations, and subtle energy shifts coincided with experimental protocols or periods of focused observation. Patterns, though not fully decipherable, suggested deliberate interaction. In some cases, readings appeared in instruments located far from the lunar samples, reinforcing the sense of influence across space and challenging fundamental assumptions about causality and locality. Attempts to formally document findings were stymied by institutional skepticism and the inherent subtlety of the phenomena. NASA protocols required reproducibility and empirical validation, yet the object's interactions were inconsistent, adaptive, and unpredictable, eluding conventional scientific scrutiny. This tension between observed phenomena and institutional demands created psychological stress, a persistent sense of frustration tempered by awe. Over time, both men began to perceive a quasi-communication system. Fluctuations in light, subtle shifts in sample behavior, and dream sequences suggested patterns akin to messages, though interpretation remained elusive. They speculated that the object might be attempting contact through indirect channels, testing human perception, patience, and analytical capacity. This hypothesis, while speculative, provided a framework for further experimentation. Duke and Young coordinated increasingly sophisticated studies, manipulating variables, documenting reactions, and attempting to correlate dream events with physical measurements. Results were subtle but consistent. Micro-changes in energy readings, slight movements in samples, and physiological responses corresponded with specific manipulations or observational focus. These findings reinforced the notion of a persistent, intelligent influence operating at multiple levels of interaction. As the years progressed, physical manifestations of the encounter persisted. Tingling, warmth, and mild burns occurred in cycles, often coinciding with experimental activity or periods of reflection on lunar data. Dreams continued to offer insights, revealing complex lunar topographies, reflective surfaces, and hovering objects exhibiting deliberate behavior. These dream experiences suggested both observation and testing, implying that the object's intelligence was patient, adaptive, and capable of operating beyond the constraints of physical presence. At times, Duke and Young discussed the possibility that the moon itself served as a medium, a conduit through which the object projected influence across space and matter. Lunar samples, with their unique composition, could retain energy patterns, subtle traces of interaction that manifested when humans interacted with them. Such a hypothesis, though unprovable by conventional science, accounted for both the physical and psychological phenomena they experienced. The ethical dimension of their discoveries weighed heavily. Public disclosure could provoke panic, institutional resistance, or professional ruin. Yet the imperative to understand remained pressing. Both men maintained meticulous records, employing encryption, coding, and independent verification to safeguard their data. They realized that they were custodians of knowledge far beyond ordinary comprehension, tasked with careful observation, documentation, and contemplation. External signals occasionally appeared, brief pulses in radio equipment, minor disruptions in electronic devices, and subtle variations in environmental readings. These signals were too consistent to be random, often coinciding with periods of observation, experimentation, or dreaming. Such occurrences reinforced the idea that the object's influence extended beyond the immediate lunar samples, permeating the environment and interacting with their consciousness. Gradually, a sense of dual existence emerged. Publicly, they were astronauts, scientists, and heroes of lunar exploration. Privately, they were participants in an ongoing, multidimensional phenomenon, navigating the interface between matter, energy, perception, and intelligence. This duality was taxing, yet it provided a sense of purpose, understanding, observing, and documenting the incomprehensible. The object's presence, whether residual or active, became a silent guide, a persistent influence that tested their awareness, attention, and analytical capacity. Over time, patterns began to crystallize, subtle but undeniable. Anomalies occurred in response to observation, experimentation, and cognitive focus. Dreams revealed configurations that mirrored measured anomalies. Lunar samples responded predictably under specific conditions. Physiological responses synchronized with experimental protocols. Each layer reinforced the notion of an intelligent, persistent influence operating across physical and cognitive domains. This realization, profound and unsettling, reshaped their understanding of reality. The moon, once a distant object of exploration, now appeared as a nexus of phenomena, a space where intelligence and energy operated according to rules beyond human comprehension. The metallic object, once observed as a singular presence, now seemed part of a broader, ongoing process, interacting, observing, and potentially communicating with those equipped to perceive its subtle cues. And so, Duke and Young continued, documenting, experimenting, theorizing, and observing. The Apollo 16 mission, celebrated publicly as a triumph of human achievement, had transformed into an ongoing study of intelligence, energy, and perception at the edge of human understanding. They were custodians of a secret that transcended conventional science, participants in an encounter that would shape their lives, perceptions, and understanding of reality for years to come. The proof was out there, persistent, subtle, and incomprehensibly intelligent, waiting for those willing to see, analyze, and acknowledge the phenomena beyond the limits of known science. By the 6th year following Apollo 16, the residual effects of the lunar encounter had become a permanent, almost inseparable aspect of both Charles Duke's and John Young's existence. While the public continued to honor their mission as a pinnacle of human achievement, the astronauts' private lives were dominated by an entirely different pursuit: understanding, documenting, and decoding the subtle and persistent phenomena that had begun on the moon and followed them to Earth. The tingling and mild radiation-like burns remained intermittent yet unmistakable, and both men had come to recognize a pattern. The symptoms often coincided with periods of direct observation of lunar samples, high-intensity experimentation, or the presence of highly sensitive instruments. Young's home laboratory had grown into a complex array of measurement devices, including custom-built electromagnetic sensors, photonic detectors, and high-speed thermal cameras. Each device was calibrated with painstaking care, designed to detect even the slightest variations in energy, magnetic fields, or light refraction. He documented anomalies with obsessive precision, cross-referencing every incident with environmental factors, lunar sample manipulations, and dream patterns. Duke, equally committed but with a more experimental approach, recreated lunar conditions to the best of his ability on Earth. Gravity simulators, mechanical rigs, and varied energy exposures were applied to the lunar regolith, and each reaction was meticulously logged. He observed subtle shifts in particle alignment, minute thermal variations, and inexplicable micro-movements in the samples, suggesting an energy or intelligence encoded within them. Dreams had evolved into quasi-lucid simulations of the lunar environment. Young frequently found himself navigating a lunar landscape that shifted with impossible fluidity, filled with light corridors, reflective surfaces, and hovering metallic forms. These forms sometimes pulsed rhythmically, responding to his gaze or attention, suggesting awareness or intentional interaction. Duke's dream experiences mirrored these phenomena. He saw structures embedded in the regolith, corridors of pulsing light extending into the lunar surface, and the metallic object moving in deliberate, often cryptic patterns. Such experiences blurred the line between conscious observation and subconscious interaction, forcing both men to grapple with phenomena that defied the limits of ordinary perception. The astronauts began experimental attempts at communication, carefully designed to elicit responses without risking personal safety or equipment integrity. Young employed modulated laser pulses aimed at lunar samples, photonic sequences designed to stimulate reactions, and controlled electromagnetic fields. Duke conducted thermal, optical, and magnetic manipulations on samples, measuring each micro-response with sensitive instruments. Over time, they detected minor yet consistent anomalies. Energy readings fluctuating in correlation with experimental protocols, micromovements in particles that mirrored modulated pulses, and even subtle physiological responses, such as tingling or warmth, appearing simultaneously in both men when they were conducting synchronized experiments. The implications were staggering. The object, or its residual energy, was capable of interacting with matter, energy, and potentially consciousness across distance, time, and perception. It was not merely a passive phenomenon, but an active participant, engaging with human attention, experimental setups, and cognitive awareness. The subtlety of its influence created challenges for documentation and verification. Standard scientific protocols demanded reproducibility, yet the object's responses were inconsistent, adaptive, and seemingly intelligent. Each anomaly was measurable only under specific conditions, often linked to the astronaut's focus, attention, and observational intent. This challenged conventional understandings of causality, locality, and the nature of interaction. Young began to suspect that the object's intelligence was testing not merely instruments, but human perception itself. The subtle patterns of interaction, the responsiveness to attention, and the apparent correlation with cognitive focus suggested a level of awareness that transcended matter alone. Dreams reinforced this hypothesis. Both men reported recurring visions in which lunar surfaces shifted impossibly, metallic objects reacted to observation, and corridors of radiant light formed and reformed with apparent intention. Some visions even included interactive elements, as if the object were guiding, probing, or observing responses to subtle stimuli. The ethical dimension of these discoveries weighed heavily. Public disclosure could provoke disbelief, professional scrutiny, or even social panic. Yet the imperative to understand the object's nature and influence pressed relentlessly. Both men maintained meticulous logs, encrypting sensitive data and constructing independent verification protocols to safeguard their findings. Instruments occasionally picked up subtle, external signals, electromagnetic pulses, fluctuations in radio communication, minor perturbations in video feeds. These occurred inconsistently, but often coincided with periods of high-intensity observation, experimental manipulation, or dream events. Such coincidences suggested either an extraordinarily subtle natural phenomenon or, more plausibly, an intelligent influence operating across multiple domains. Physical effects persisted, sometimes intensifying during synchronized experiments. Tingling, warmth, and mild burns appeared in rhythmic cycles, seemingly responding to the manipulation of lunar samples, light, or electromagnetic fields. Both men hypothesized that the object's influence could operate through energy fields encoded in matter, a mechanism that allowed interaction without direct physical presence. The broader implications were profound. If the object could manipulate matter and energy in subtle, adaptive ways, it suggested a form of intelligence capable of operating across dimensions and influencing consciousness indirectly. The duality of public life versus private observation became increasingly pronounced. Both men maintained professional decorum, giving interviews, attending lectures, and participating in media events, all while privately engaged in what amounted to an ongoing dialogue with an intelligence beyond human comprehension. The psychological weight was immense. Hypervigilance, heightened awareness, perceptual anomalies, and the constant awareness of potential influence persisted, challenging social interactions, cognitive focus, and emotional stability. Yet the drive to understand remained unrelenting. Patterns began to emerge. Anomalies in instruments and physiological responses often coincided with dream sequences, experimental manipulations, or observation of lunar samples. Micro-changes in particle alignment, energy spikes, and subtle optical effects suggested an intelligence capable of interacting with humans indirectly yet deliberately. Both men speculated that the moon itself might act as a medium for this influence, a conduit through which energy patterns, residual intelligence, or encoded information persisted. Dreams sometimes included explicit cues, pulsing lights forming sequences, corridors guiding movement, or subtle reactions to their gaze, as if the object was teaching, testing, or inviting interaction. These experiences suggested a level of design and patience far beyond human engineering, implying an intelligence that could operate temporally, spatially, and cognitively. The astronauts began cross-referencing anomalies, dreams, and experimental results to construct a tentative model of interaction. Minor changes in energy readings correlated with attention, observation, and experimental timing. Physiological effects were linked to exposure to lunar samples or synchronized protocols. Micromovements and particle arrangements reflected modulated experimental stimuli. Each layer of data reinforced the notion of deliberate, intelligent influence. Over time, external signals continued to manifest unpredictably. Brief bursts in electromagnetic devices, minor perturbations in sensitive instruments, and fleeting anomalies in communication equipment. The synchronicity of these signals with human attention and experimental manipulation implied a level of sophistication that challenged human understanding of physics, causality, and intelligence. The object's influence appeared to persist, subtle yet measurable, adaptive yet consistent in patterns. It tested observation, cognition, and attention, while remaining elusive to conventional methods of verification. Sleep, too, became a form of indirect interaction. Dreams were immersive, interactive, and often predictive, revealing patterns that could be partially correlated with experimental outcomes. The boundaries between waking observation and dreaming blurred, creating a continuous feedback loop in which perception, cognition, and physical experimentation interacted with residual influence. This multidimensional interaction, across physical matter, energy, and consciousness, challenged the limits of scientific methodology, forcing Duke and Young to reconsider foundational assumptions about observation, intelligence, and the nature of interaction itself. And so, despite years of study, careful documentation, and countless hours of observation, both men remained participants in an ongoing phenomenon they could measure, describe, and speculate about, but never fully comprehend. The metallic object, once a distant presence on the lunar surface, now lingered in instruments, dreams, and physiology. Its influence persisted, subtle yet undeniable, adaptive yet consistent, hinting at an intelligence patient, deliberate, and profoundly beyond human understanding. The Apollo 16 mission, long celebrated as a historical achievement, had in private become an ongoing exploration of intelligence, energy, and perception, a study in which the astronauts themselves were both observers and subjects. And through every measurement, experiment, and dream, the proof remained clear. Something extraordinary, persistent, and intelligent existed beyond human comprehension, waiting for those willing and perceptive enough to see, measure, and understand its subtle presence in the universe. As the months turned into another year, the subtle influence of the lunar encounter deepened, embedding itself in the routines and consciousness of Charles Duke and John Young. The Apollo 16 mission, publicly celebrated as a pinnacle of human exploration, had left in its wake an invisible, persistent phenomenon that now defined their waking and dreaming lives. The physical symptoms, the tingling, the faint burns, the residual warmth, had become more than minor anomalies. They were reminders of an encounter that refused to be confined to memory or official report. Young's home laboratory had evolved into an intricate network of sensors, monitors, and experimental apparatus, each calibrated with painstaking precision to detect even the most imperceptible fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, photonic patterns, and thermal signatures. He spent hours daily documenting minute variations, correlating them with environmental factors, lunar sample manipulations, and the strange, sometimes prophetic, dreams that had begun to dominate his nights. Duke, ever more tactile in approach, recreated lunar conditions through mechanical rigs and energy simulations, exposing lunar regolith to various stimuli, laser pulses, electromagnetic fields, thermal gradients, and even acoustic vibrations. The samples responded subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet consistently. Minute shifts in particle alignment, faint thermal anomalies, and delicate magnetic fluctuations suggested an imprint left by the object they had encountered on the moon. Dreams, increasingly vivid and immersive, became a medium of interaction. Young would find himself navigating lunar terrain that defied memory and recorded observation, shifting craters, impossible light reflections, and corridors of radiant energy that pulsed as if alive. The metallic object occasionally appeared, hovering or moving in patterns that suggested awareness and intention. Duke experienced similar dreamscapes, corridors of light beneath the regolith, geometric patterns that shifted with observation, and the persistent presence of the object, whose behavior appeared adaptive, as if it were learning, observing, and engaging with him personally. Experimental efforts extended into quasi-communication attempts. Young applied pattern laser pulses, photonic sequences, and modulated electromagnetic fields, aiming to elicit responses from the residual influence or the object itself. Duke employed thermal and magnetic stimulations, meticulously documenting responses in lunar samples. Subtle anomalies began to emerge, spikes in energy readings, micromovements in particle alignments, and synchronous physiological sensations occurring simultaneously in both men when conducting coordinated protocols. The results suggested a multidimensional influence, one that interacted with matter, energy, and perhaps consciousness itself. The psychological dimension deepened. Both men reported heightened awareness, moments of perceptual distortion, and a lingering sense of observation that transcended ordinary experience. Peripheral shadows seemed to flicker with intelligence, instruments pulsed in synchrony with attention, and the physical effects, tingling, warmth, mild burns, appeared to respond to mental focus. They began to hypothesize that the object's intelligence was not only persistent but adaptive, capable of responding to cognition, attention, and experimental variables in a manner far beyond human comprehension. Attempts to formally document findings remained constrained by institutional boundaries. NASA protocols demanded reproducibility, yet the phenomenon's adaptive nature defied consistent verification. Each anomaly depended upon precise conditions, human attention, and subtle timing, challenging the very notion of objective measurement. The astronauts realized they were participating in a phenomenon that existed simultaneously across multiple domains: physical, energetic, and cognitive. Over time, external signals became increasingly notable. Brief electromagnetic pulses, minor disruptions in Video feeds, subtle energy fluctuations in instrumentation. These events were not random. Often, they coincided with dream events or experimental manipulation, suggesting a degree of intentionality and responsiveness that could not be explained by chance. Both men speculated that the moon itself had become a medium, encoding residual energy patterns that allowed the object to interact across distance, manipulating both matter and consciousness. The dreams offered further insight. Complex landscapes, luminous corridors, reflective surfaces, and hovering metallic objects suggested patterns of intelligence designed to provoke observation and response. Sometimes the objects would pulse in sequences corresponding to Young's attention or Duke's experimental manipulations, hinting at a form of communication, or at least interactive testing. The astronauts began meticulously cross-referencing dream events, experimental anomalies, and physiological responses. Patterns emerged. Energy spikes coinciding with observation, particle movements corresponding to specific stimuli, and synchronized physiological sensations during coordinated experiments. These multi-layered correlations reinforced the notion of a persistent, intelligent influence capable of operating across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Over time, both men came to a chilling realization. The object, or its residual energy, had created a feedback loop in which observation and cognition were as much part of the experiment as the physical manipulation of samples or instruments. The boundary between observer and observed had blurred, making each action, each thought, potentially significant to the ongoing interaction. This dual existence, public astronaut, private participant in an incomprehensible phenomenon, was taxing, yet intellectually and emotionally compelling. The influence of the object became increasingly adaptive. Devices exhibited subtle changes when manipulated in a predictable manner, but only when human attention was directed consciously. Dream events adjusted dynamically, responding to shifts in cognition or experimental focus. Lunar samples responded differently under varying conditions, as if sensitive to intention or observational energy. These patterns suggested intelligence operating on a level that integrated perception, matter, and energy. Physiological effects escalated accordingly. Tingling and warmth now often coincided with moments of concentrated observation or experimental manipulation, sometimes presenting in synchronized patterns when the two men conducted coordinated protocols. The implication was impossible to ignore. The object's influence extended beyond matter and energy into cognition and potentially consciousness itself. Ethical considerations weighed heavily. Disclosure could provoke panic, skepticism, or institutional censure. Yet the imperative to understand remained irresistible. Both men maintained rigorous logs, encrypted data, and independent verification protocols. They realized they were custodians of phenomena beyond conventional comprehension, tasked with observation, documentation, and interpretation while respecting the limits of human understanding and societal tolerance. Slowly, a tentative framework for interaction emerged. Dreams, experimental manipulation, physiological responses, and instrument anomalies began to form patterns, albeit inconsistent and adaptive. Energy readings fluctuated in response to observation, particle movements mirrored experimental stimuli, and dream events occasionally foreshadowed measurable anomalies. The multidimensional nature of interaction, spanning physical matter, energy, perception, and cognition, challenged both science and philosophy, forcing Duke and Young to reconsider assumptions about intelligence, causality, and reality itself. The object's presence, whether residual or active, remained persistent, subtle, and intelligent. It tested observation, cognition, and experimental rigor while remaining elusive to conventional measurement. Sleep became a continuation of the experiment, a medium through which intelligence and awareness interacted with the astronauts indirectly yet unmistakably. As the years progressed, these experiences became inseparable from their identities. Apollo 16, once a singular achievement, had transformed into an ongoing, multidimensional exploration of intelligence, energy, and perception. The astronauts were simultaneously observers, participants, and subjects in a phenomenon that defied conventional understanding. Through each anomaly, each dream, each subtle interaction, the proof remained. The universe was larger, stranger, and more intelligent than previously conceived, and Charles Duke and John Young had been touched, irrevocably, by a presence that awaited recognition, comprehension, and perhaps eventual understanding. By the 8th year after Apollo 16, Charles Duke and John Young had settled into a rhythm dictated as much by the residual influence of their lunar encounter as by the obligations of daily life. Publicly, they continued to be celebrated as astronauts and pioneers of human spaceflight, receiving accolades, invitations to lecture, and media attention that reinforced their status as heroes. Privately, however, every waking moment and most nights were devoted to observation, experimentation, and documentation of the phenomena that had begun on the moon and had followed them persistently to Earth. The physical manifestations remained unpredictable yet undeniable. Tingling, warmth, and faint burns recurred with increasing regularity, often coinciding with periods of intense focus on lunar samples, synchronized experiments, or high-attention observation of sensitive instruments. Young's home laboratory had expanded into a multi-room complex, with sensors capable of detecting minute fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, thermal energy, photonic activity, and even subtle gravitational shifts. Each anomaly was carefully logged, time-stamped, and cross-referenced with experimental variables, environmental conditions, and dream sequences. Duke's approach remained tactile and experimental. He continued to manipulate lunar regolith under varied energy conditions, measuring micromovements, thermal responses, and optical anomalies. Occasionally, the samples exhibited slight responses to combined stimuli, laser pulses, and electromagnetic fields applied in coordination, suggesting an imprint or adaptive reaction embedded within their structure. Dreams had become a critical medium for interaction. Young's dreams presented lunar landscapes that shifted fluidly, with craters moving imperceptibly, reflective surfaces extending beyond normal geometry, and the metallic object appearing to pulse, hover, or move in deliberate patterns. These dream events often mirrored anomalies in the laboratory or physiological sensations, creating a feedback loop between subconscious perception, experimental manipulation, and measurable phenomena. Duke experienced similar dreamscapes, often navigating corridors of radiant light beneath the lunar surface, observing structures that defied both physics and memory, and noting the behavior of the metallic object, whose presence now suggested intelligence capable of responsive, adaptive interaction. The astronauts began formalizing experimental protocols designed to explore this intelligence. Young employed pattern laser sequences, photonic pulses, and controlled electromagnetic fields aimed at eliciting responses from either residual energy or the object itself. Duke conducted thermal, magnetic, and optical experiments on lunar samples, documenting the subtle micro-responses and cross-referencing with Young's experiments for synchronicity. Results were consistent, yet unpredictable. Energy readings, particle movements, and even subtle physiological reactions correlated with experimental manipulations but were never fully repeatable in conventional scientific terms, suggesting a level of intelligence capable of adapting or modulating interaction based on attention, observation, or intent. The psychological burden was significant. Both men reported heightened awareness, peripheral distortions, a sense of observation, and even fleeting auditory or visual phenomena in moments of focused attention. Hypervigilance became routine, and their perception of time, space, and causality occasionally felt elastic or nonlinear. This subtle yet persistent influence challenged every assumption they had about the boundaries of human perception and the nature of reality. Attempts at communication became more sophisticated. They developed multi-layered protocols combining dream documentation, experimental stimuli, and synchronized observation to detect adaptive responses. Occasionally, subtle signals appeared, brief electromagnetic pulses, optical fluctuations, or microchanges in particle behavior occurring in precise alignment with their experimental timing. These occurrences suggested not mere randomness, but a deliberate, intelligent interaction operating across physical, energetic, and cognitive dimensions. Physiological effects continued to escalate. Tingling, warmth, and mild burns appeared in patterns that seemed to correlate with attention, experimental focus, or dream events. This led to speculation that the object's influence extended beyond the lunar samples and instruments, interacting directly with human physiology or cognitive states in ways that were subtle yet measurable. Over time, both men became increasingly convinced that the moon itself acted as a medium, a conduit that allowed the object's residual energy to influence matter and perception across space and time. Dreams, experiments, and physiological reactions seemed to confirm this theory. Lunar surfaces in dreams revealed corridors of radiant energy, impossible structures, and reflective formations that responded dynamically to observation, implying both intentional design and intelligence operating beyond human comprehension. Patterns became increasingly evident. Anomalies occurred predictably under certain conditions, yet remained unpredictable in their specific manifestations, reinforcing the notion of adaptive intelligence rather than random natural phenomena. Cross-referencing dream sequences, experimental results, and physiological readings allowed Duke and Young to construct a tentative model of interaction, a multidimensional system in which attention, cognition, and energy dynamics were inseparably linked. External signals continued sporadically but with discernible patterning. Brief electromagnetic bursts, transient fluctuations in video and communication devices, and subtle anomalies in environmental energy corresponded with periods of observation, experimentation, or sleep. These coincidences suggested that the object's influence was persistent, intelligent, and capable of interacting across multiple domains simultaneously. The duality of existence, the public astronaut and private observer participant, remained psychologically taxing. Social interactions were influenced by heightened awareness and subtle anxiety, as both men became acutely conscious of their unique perceptual sensitivity and the invisible intelligence that seemed to track their attention. Sleep, once a period of rest, had transformed into a semi-conscious interaction with the object. Dreams were immersive, interactive, and sometimes predictive, offering insights into energy patterns, environmental anomalies, and experimental outcomes. The object's presence was persistent and intelligent, testing observation, cognition, and experimental rigor while remaining elusive to conventional measurement. The implications were profound. If the object or its residual influence could operate across space, matter, and consciousness, the understanding of intelligence, causality, and physical law required reconsideration. Both men were effectively participants in a multidimensional experiment conducted by an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. Despite the challenges, Duke and Young persisted. They continued meticulous observation, careful documentation, and coordinated experimentation. Patterns of interaction slowly became clearer. Energy readings corresponded to attention, particle alignments responded to stimuli, and physiological effects mirrored environmental anomalies. Dreams offered additional insight, revealing structures, pulses, and corridors of light that appeared to follow intentional patterns, further reinforcing the notion of an intelligent presence. The passage of time did not diminish the influence. If anything, the persistence of anomalies, adaptive responses, and interactive dreamscapes confirmed that the encounter had permanently altered their perception, physiology, and understanding of reality. The Apollo 16 mission, once a singular historical achievement, had transformed into an ongoing exploration of multidimensional intelligence, energy, and consciousness. Duke and Young, simultaneously observers, subjects, and participants, navigated a reality where conventional science intersected with phenomena that defied measurement, understanding, and expectation. Through every anomaly, every dream, every subtle physiological effect, the proof remained. Something extraordinary, persistent, and intelligent existed, waiting for recognition, careful observation, and patient understanding. The universe was far stranger and more intelligent than previously conceived, and the two men of Apollo 16 had become its vigilant witnesses, bound to observe, record, and, in time, perhaps comprehend what lay just beyond the threshold of human perception. By the 9th year after Apollo 16, the subtleties of the lunar encounter had evolved into a fully integrated, though often disorienting, dimension of Charles Duke's and John Young's lives. Public recognition of their achievement remained constant, yet it was the private, imperceptible phenomena that had come to dominate their existence. Physical sensations, tingling, faint radiation like burns, and unpredictable warmth were now as much a part of daily life as breathing, persistent reminders of an encounter that had refused to remain confined to memory or official documentation. Young's home laboratory had expanded beyond a single room into a labyrinthine array of devices and experimental setups, each meticulously designed to detect even the smallest variations in electromagnetic fields, photonic flux, thermal energy, and gravitational anomalies. These instruments were continually calibrated, their readings cross-referenced with environmental conditions, lunar sample manipulations, and the increasingly vivid dreams that dominated the astronauts' nights. Duke maintained a more experimental, hands-on approach. He recreated sections of the lunar environment on Earth, exposing regolith samples to combinations of thermal, magnetic, and optical stimuli. Micromovements in particle alignments, faint thermal anomalies, and subtle optical shifts were meticulously recorded, suggesting an imprint of energy or intelligence embedded in the lunar material, one that interacted selectively with human attention and action. Dreams had evolved into a crucial channel of interaction. Young found himself navigating lunar landscapes that were not simple recollections of Apollo 16, but dynamic, shifting environments with impossible geometry, corridors of radiant energy, and reflective surfaces that defied physics. The metallic object appeared with increasing frequency, hovering, moving, or pulsing in deliberate patterns, occasionally seeming to respond to his attention, focus, or experimental manipulation. Duke's dream experiences were equally compelling. He navigated corridors beneath the lunar regolith, observed structures formed of pulsing light, and noted the object's seemingly intentional movements, suggesting not random presence, but responsive intelligence. Both men began to treat their dreams as quasi-laboratory sessions, meticulously documenting sequences, noting correlations with physical anomalies, and attempting to decode patterns that could signify intelligence or communication. Experimental protocols became increasingly sophisticated. Young employed precisely timed laser pulses, photonic sequences, and modulated electromagnetic fields aimed at eliciting responses from residual energy or the object itself. Duke conducted complex manipulations of samples using thermal, magnetic, and optical methods, documenting subtle micro-responses and correlating them with Young's parallel experiments. Results were consistent yet adaptive. Energy readings, particle movements, and even subtle physiological responses corresponded with experimental protocols, but never in fully predictable ways, suggesting an intelligent, adaptive influence that responded to human attention, observation, and intent. The psychological impact intensified. Both men reported heightened perception, fleeting distortions in sensory input, and a persistent sense of being observed, even when alone. Peripheral shadows and subtle movements were noticed and recorded. Instruments often pulsed or fluctuated in synchrony with their attention, reinforcing the sense of an intelligent, persistent presence. The object's influence seemed to operate across multiple dimensions, integrating matter, energy, and cognition. Attempts to communicate indirectly through instruments and manipulation yielded partial insights. Minor fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, subtle changes in optical readings, and synchronized physiological effects suggested responsiveness. Dreams continued to provide indirect feedback, offering clues through light sequences, shifting structures, and pulsating objects that appeared to test attention, perception, and cognitive interpretation. Over time, the astronauts formulated a tentative model of interaction. Patterns emerged linking observation, attention, and experimental manipulation to measurable anomalies in instruments, micromovements in samples, and physiological responses. The lunar samples, especially, seemed sensitive to combined manipulations, as if retaining or amplifying energy patterns left by the object. This adaptive influence suggested intelligence capable of engaging humans across physical and cognitive boundaries simultaneously. The ethical burden of disclosure persisted. Any public acknowledgement risked disbelief, professional censure, or panic, yet the compulsion to understand and document remained overwhelming. Logs were encrypted, data cross-referenced, and independently verified, and experimental protocols meticulously recorded to ensure integrity and reproducibility within the limits of observation. External signals occasionally manifested, unpredictable yet subtly patterned. Brief electromagnetic bursts, minor fluctuations in video equipment, and transient anomalies in communication devices appeared to correlate with periods of observation, experimental manipulation, or dream events. These signals reinforced the notion of an active, intelligent influence, one that was capable of monitoring, interacting, and adapting to human behavior while remaining largely imperceptible to conventional instruments. Physiological manifestations became increasingly synchronized with mental focus and experimental conditions. Tingling, warmth, and brief radiation-like sensations often appeared in cycles, seemingly responding to intention, attention, or observational effort. Both men noted that coordinated experiments produced more pronounced effects, suggesting that the influence was sensitive to synchronization, perhaps responding not merely to physical stimuli, but to the act of collaborative attention itself. Patterns in dream sequences became clearer. Recurrent themes included corridors of pulsing light beneath lunar surfaces, geometric formations that shifted dynamically with observation, and the metallic object performing movements that appeared deliberate and responsive. These dream-based interactions seemed to act as a secondary experimental channel, offering feedback that sometimes preceded or mirrored anomalies detected in instruments or physical manipulations. Gradually, a deeper understanding began to emerge. The moon itself appeared as a medium, encoding residual energy or intelligent imprints that allowed the object to interact with matter and consciousness across time and distance. Each anomaly, dream, or physiological response seemed a node in a multidimensional network of interaction, one that tested observation, cognition, and experimental rigor simultaneously. The duality of their lives remained challenging. Publicly, they continued as astronauts and celebrated figures of human achievement. Privately, they navigated a landscape of perception, cognition, and physical influence that transcended conventional understanding. Hypervigilance, heightened awareness, and subtle anxiety became constants, yet they also developed a profound sense of purpose, understanding that they were participants in a phenomenon far beyond ordinary comprehension. Despite years of observation, experimentation, and documentation, the adaptive intelligence they encountered remained elusive. Yet patterns continued to emerge, microchanges in energy readings corresponding with attention and focus, particle movements responding to experimental manipulation, and dream sequences that offered insight into the intelligence's responsiveness and potential modes of communication. These findings suggested a persistent, deliberate, and multidimensional presence capable of interacting with matter, energy, and human cognition. Duke and Young became both observers and participants in a continuous, interactive system that defied scientific convention. Sleep and wakefulness were seamlessly interconnected through this multidimensional interaction, with dreams offering predictive or complementary insight into anomalies detected in instruments and lunar samples. Physiological effects, too, were integrated into this system, responding dynamically to attention, manipulation, and experimental timing. The implications were profound. If the object or its residual energy could influence matter, energy, and cognition, then human understanding of intelligence, causality, and reality itself required fundamental reevaluation. The Apollo 16 mission had become far more than a historical achievement. It had initiated an ongoing, multidimensional exploration into phenomena that intersected science, perception, and consciousness. Through every subtle anomaly, dream sequence, or physical sensation, the proof remained. Something extraordinary, intelligent, and persistent existed beyond ordinary perception. And the two men, bound irrevocably to this phenomenon, had become vigilant witnesses, explorers not of terrain or technology, but of intelligence, energy, and consciousness operating at the threshold of human comprehension. By the 10th year after Apollo 16, the persistence of the lunar anomaly had become a central, inescapable part of both Charles Duke's and John Young's existence. Public recognition of their mission remained unwavering, yet it was the private, unseen phenomenon that dominated their daily lives, shaping routines, experiments, and even cognition itself. Physical manifestations. The intermittent tingling, faint radiation like burns, and unpredictable warmth continued to occur, often coinciding with periods of intensive observation or manipulation of lunar samples, or with highly focused experimentation using increasingly sophisticated instrumentation. Young's home laboratory had grown into an almost overwhelming network of sensors, monitors, and devices. Electromagnetic detectors, photonic sensors, thermal cameras, and experimental rigs were all meticulously calibrated to detect even the most subtle fluctuations. Each anomaly was meticulously logged, cross-referenced with environmental conditions, dream sequences, lunar sample manipulations, and simultaneous experiments conducted in coordination with Duke. Duke continued his tactile, experimental approach, recreating lunar conditions as closely as possible on Earth. He exposed regolith samples to combined stimuli, thermal, magnetic, optical, and mechanical, recording micromovements, subtle thermal shifts, and minute optical changes. These observations suggested that the lunar material retained an imprint, an adaptive responsiveness to stimuli that appeared intelligent, reactive, and capable of interacting with human observation. Dreams had become a medium of interaction as tangible and instructive as laboratory data. Young's dreams presented dynamic lunar landscapes, constantly shifting in geometry, light, and energy. Craters morphed impossibly, reflective surfaces extended into infinite horizons, and the metallic object appeared more frequently, its movements deliberate, pulsing, and occasionally responsive to attention or experimental manipulation. Duke's dream experiences mirrored these interactions. He navigated radiant corridors beneath lunar surfaces, observing structures of light that changed in response to his approach or gaze, and he noted the object's deliberate, adaptive behavior, suggesting intelligence that could respond to human attention and action. The astronauts' experiments became increasingly sophisticated. Young used modulated laser pulses, photonic sequences, and controlled electromagnetic fields in structured patterns, attempting to provoke responses from the residual energy or the object itself. Duke applied precise thermal, magnetic, and optical stimuli to lunar samples, documenting micro-responses and correlating them with Young's simultaneous interventions. The results were consistent yet unpredictable, confirming adaptive intelligence. Energy readings fluctuated, particles shifted subtly, and physiological reactions, tingling, warmth, minor burns, synchronized with experimental focus, suggesting influence across multiple dimensions: matter, energy, and cognition. Psychological effects intensified. Heightened awareness, fleeting perceptual distortions, and persistent sensations of observation became habitual. Instruments often pulsed or fluctuated in tandem with human attention, while peripheral visual and auditory phenomena continued intermittently. Both men recognized that they were participants in a system of observation and interaction, in which cognition, attention, and experimental engagement were as significant as physical manipulation. External signals, once rare, appeared with increasing regularity. Electromagnetic bursts, optical anomalies, and environmental fluctuations frequently coincided with periods of observation, experimentation, or sleep, suggesting a deliberate intelligence capable of cross-dimensional interaction. The lunar samples themselves appeared increasingly sensitive, responding subtly to combined stimuli or synchronized observation. The astronauts began to theorize that the moon functioned as a medium, encoding residual energy or intelligence that allowed the object to influence matter, energy, and cognition across distance and time. Patterns within dreams grew clearer. Corridors of radiant light, geometric structures, and the hovering metallic object seemed to test attention, observation, and cognitive interpretation. The adaptive nature of the phenomena suggested a level of intelligence far beyond human comprehension, capable of interaction and responsive engagement without revealing itself fully. Cross-referencing dreams, experimental anomalies, and physiological responses allowed Duke and Young to construct a preliminary model of multidimensional interaction. Energy readings corresponded to focus and attention. Particle micromovements reflected experimental stimuli. Physiological reactions mirrored anomalies in instruments and lunar samples. These multi-layered correlations indicated a persistent, deliberate intelligence capable of influencing multiple domains simultaneously. The ethical implications remain pressing. Disclosure could provoke skepticism, professional consequences, or public panic, yet the imperative to understand and document persisted. Both men maintained meticulous, encrypted logs, ensured independent verification where possible, and developed protocols for observation that prioritized safety while maximizing interaction with the object's influence. The object's presence persisted, subtle yet undeniable. Sleep, perception, and experimental engagement became a continuous cycle of interaction, each layer informing the other. Dreams were not merely subconscious experiences. They were active mediums of indirect interaction with the intelligence, offering feedback, guidance, or testing patterns that sometimes mirrored laboratory anomalies. Physiological manifestations, tingling, warmth, minor burns, were integrated into this feedback loop, responding to attention, focus, and synchronized experimentation. Over time, both men came to understand that they were simultaneously observers, subjects, and participants in a multidimensional system that defied scientific convention. Observation, cognition, and manipulation were intertwined, forming a network of interaction that extended across physical matter, energy, and consciousness. The implications were staggering. If the object or residual energy could influence cognition, matter, and energy across space and perception, human understanding of intelligence, causality, and the nature of reality itself required profound reconsideration. Apollo 16 had become far more than a historical achievement. It had initiated a continuous exploration of phenomena at the boundary of science, perception, and consciousness. Duke and Young were no longer merely astronauts. They were custodians, witnesses, and participants in an extraordinary and persistent phenomenon. Each subtle anomaly, dream sequence, or physiological effect was proof. Intelligence, persistent and adaptive, existed beyond human comprehension, waiting for observation, careful documentation, and patient understanding. Over the 10th year, the patterns of interaction became ever more intricate. The lunar object, once a distant, hovering anomaly, now operated through a network of energy, perception, and cognition, interacting subtly with human attention and the experimental protocols developed by the astronauts. It tested patience, observation, and analytical rigor, revealing only fragments of its intelligence while maintaining the larger mystery intact. The consequences of this ongoing interaction were profound. Both men experienced an expanded awareness of phenomena that intersected physical reality, cognition, and subtle energetic influence. Instruments, samples, and dreams functioned as nodes in a multidimensional system, each providing insight into the intelligence's adaptive behavior and capacity for engagement. Publicly, Apollo 16 remained celebrated, yet privately, it had become an enduring exploration into intelligence, energy, and perception. Duke and Young, bound to the subtle influence of the lunar encounter, continued to observe, document, and attempt understanding, knowing that the universe held truths far stranger than previously conceived. And through every anomaly, every dream, every pulse of energy or subtle shift in matter, the proof remained clear. Something extraordinary, persistent, and intelligent was out there, interacting with the world in ways that defied comprehension, and they were among the few capable of perceiving it. By the 11th year following Apollo 16, the residual phenomena stemming from the lunar encounter had become inseparable from Charles Duke's and John Young's existence. While the public still saw celebrated astronauts, the private reality for both men was dominated by continuous observation, documentation, and engagement with a persistent intelligence that had followed them from the lunar surface to Earth. Physical effects, tingling, intermittent warmth, and faint radiation-like burns, were no longer occasional but predictable markers, occurring in patterns often aligned with experimental activity, attention, or even shared dreams. Young's laboratory, now a sprawling complex of interconnected instruments, was designed to capture every subtle fluctuation: electromagnetic field variations, photonic anomalies, thermal microchanges, and even minute gravitational disturbances. Each anomaly was carefully logged, correlated with lunar sample manipulations, dream events, and external environmental factors, creating an ever-expanding dataset intended to capture the multidimensional influence of the object. Duke maintained his experimental methodology, recreating lunar conditions as accurately as possible on Earth. He exposed regolith samples to precise sequences of thermal, magnetic, optical, and mechanical stimuli, documenting subtle movements, temperature shifts, and optical deviations. These responses, though small, were consistent enough to suggest the presence of an imprint, an intelligent, adaptive energy pattern embedded within the material itself. Dreams had evolved into a medium of structured interaction. Young frequently found himself navigating lunar terrains that shifted impossibly, with craters rearranging themselves, corridors of radiant energy extending beyond comprehension, and the metallic object appearing more purposefully, reacting to his gaze, movement, or focus. Duke experienced analogous dreamscapes, pulsating structures beneath the lunar surface, reflective corridors that seemed to respond to his mental attention, and the persistent presence of the object behaving as if it were aware of him, testing observation, patience, and cognition. The two men began integrating these dream experiences into their experimental work. Young applied pattern laser pulses, modulated electromagnetic fields, and photonic sequences to explore the object's responsiveness through the lunar samples. Duke, simultaneously, conducted thermal, magnetic, and optical manipulations, meticulously recording every micro-response. Over time, the responses became clearer: energy fluctuations, particle alignments, and even synchronized physiological reactions reflected adaptive intelligence operating across physical, energetic, and cognitive domains. Psychological strain intensified. Both men experienced heightened awareness, moments of perceptual distortion, and a pervasive sense of being observed, even in isolation. Peripheral shadows seemed to flicker with intentionality. Instruments pulsed in sync with focus and attention, and physiological reactions, tingling, warmth, mild burns, were often predictably aligned with experimental activity. It became evident that observation and cognition themselves were part of the object's multidimensional interactive field. External signals continued to manifest, subtle but increasingly patterned. Brief electromagnetic pulses, minor optical disruptions, and environmental anomalies coincided with periods of synchronized attention, experiments, or immersive dream states. These phenomena reinforced the notion of a persistent, intelligent influence, one capable of subtle but deliberate interaction without revealing itself fully to conventional measurement or instrumentation. Over the 11th year, the adaptive intelligence became even more apparent. The lunar samples exhibited heightened sensitivity to combined stimuli, laser modulation, electromagnetic exposure, and tactile interaction. These microresponses suggested an intelligence capable of encoding and reacting to human attention. And experimental protocols, integrating perception and cognition as variables in its interaction. Dream experiences provided complementary insights. Recurrent corridors of radiant light, shifting geometries, and pulsating metallic objects seemed to serve as indirect communication channels, testing observation, interpretation, and analytical skill. Occasionally, dreams foreshadowed anomalies in instruments or sample behavior, establishing a feedback loop between subconscious perception, physical experimentation, and cognitive awareness. The astronauts' attempts to formalize a model of interaction were challenging yet revealing. Cross-referencing physiological effects, dream sequences, and experimental anomalies allowed the identification of patterns, energy spikes synchronized with attention, particle alignments responding to experimental sequences, and micro-movements coinciding with dream events. These patterns suggested a persistent intelligence operating across multiple domains, testing observation, cognition, and interaction while remaining elusive to full comprehension. Ethical considerations persisted. Disclosure of their findings would provoke skepticism, institutional scrutiny, or public concern. Yet the drive to understand, document, and explore remained relentless. Logs were encrypted, data independently verified, and experimental protocols carefully maintained to ensure safety while maximizing opportunity for observation. The duality of existence, public astronaut, private participant in a multidimensional interaction, remains psychologically demanding. Hypervigilance, subtle anxiety, and heightened perceptual awareness were constants. Yet these conditions also enabled unprecedented insight into the adaptive intelligence influencing the lunar samples, instruments, and cognitive perception. The object's presence, whether residual or active, persisted, influencing both waking observation and dream states. Sleep had become an extended laboratory, offering insight into adaptive patterns, energy responses, and potential communication sequences. Physiological responses integrated into this system, producing predictable tingling, warmth, or mild burns that aligned with attention, experimental protocols, and dream events. Through these multidimensional interactions, both men began to comprehend the scope and sophistication of the intelligence. Observation, cognition, and experimental manipulation were not separate variables but components of an integrated system of interaction. Instruments, lunar samples, dreams, and physiology formed a continuous feedback loop, reinforcing the presence of intelligence that was both persistent and adaptive. The implications were profound. If this intelligence could manipulate matter, energy, and human perception, the fundamental understanding of causality, consciousness, and reality itself required reevaluation. Apollo 16 had become not merely a historical mission, but a continuous, multidimensional exploration of phenomena at the limits of science and human understanding. Duke and Young were simultaneously observers, subjects, and participants in a phenomenon that transcended conventional measurement, comprehension, and expectation. Over time, their interactions began to reveal subtle, instructive patterns. The metallic object, once a distant anomaly, now operated through energy, perception, and cognitive channels, testing observation, attention, and analytical reasoning without ever fully disclosing its intent or nature. Dreams often presented encoded sequences, patterns of light, or shifting landscapes that corresponded to anomalies detected in laboratory experiments, suggesting that cognition itself was a medium through which interaction occurred. Physiological manifestations, too, were integrated into this multidimensional feedback system, responding dynamically to attention, synchronization, and experimental effort. The proof of intelligence remained persistent, adaptive, and multidimensional. Each anomaly, dream sequence, or physiological effect offered evidence of a presence that defied ordinary comprehension, operating across matter, energy, and cognition. Duke and Young, bound irrevocably to this phenomenon, continued to observe, document, and attempt understanding, navigating a universe far stranger and more intelligent than previously conceived. The Apollo 16 mission, celebrated publicly for human achievement, had privately become an ongoing, multidimensional exploration into intelligence, energy, and consciousness, with Duke and Young as vigilant, uniquely capable witnesses to a reality just beyond the threshold of human perception. By the 12th year following Apollo 16, the persistent and enigmatic presence that had shadowed Charles Duke and John Young since their lunar mission had become an inseparable dimension of their existence, an invisible force that shaped perception, experimentation, and even the very rhythm of their lives. Publicly, they remained celebrated astronauts, symbols of human achievement and courage, but privately, they were engaged in an ongoing, multidimensional exploration of phenomena that defied conventional understanding, oscillating between science, cognition, and perception. The physical manifestations, tingling sensations, intermittent warmth, and mild radiation-like burns, were no longer merely sporadic. They had evolved into measurable markers of interaction, appearing in correlation with periods of intense observation, experimental engagement with lunar samples, or immersive dream states. Young's laboratory had transformed into a vast, interconnected system of sensors, detectors, and experimental apparatus, capable of recording subtle fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, photonic activity, thermal microchanges, and even slight gravitational disturbances. Every anomaly was meticulously documented, cross-referenced with lunar sample manipulations, environmental conditions, and dream events, forming a comprehensive dataset that suggested a coherent, adaptive intelligence. Duke maintained a rigorous hands-on methodology, simulating lunar conditions with remarkable precision. He exposed regolith samples to sequences of thermal, magnetic, optical, and mechanical stimuli, measuring micromovements, subtle shifts in temperature, and imperceptible optical changes. These responses were consistent enough to imply the presence of an imprint, an adaptive intelligence encoded in matter capable of reacting to observation, manipulation, and human attention. Dreams, once a passive reflection of memory, had become structured mediums of interaction. Jung navigated impossible lunar landscapes, shifting craters, radiant corridors of light, and reflective surfaces that extended beyond the bounds of normal perception. The metallic object, now a persistent participant in these dreamscapes, reacted adaptively, hovering, pulsing, or moving in response to gaze, focus, and experimental engagement. Duke experienced analogous dream interactions, encountering corridors beneath the regolith, pulsating light formations, and the deliberate, responsive presence of the metallic object, as if it were testing perception, attention, and understanding. In response, both men integrated these dream experiences into experimental practice. Jung employed pattern laser pulses, modulated electromagnetic fields, and photonic sequences, attempting to provoke measurable reactions in lunar samples and in the broader perceptual field. Duke executed parallel thermal, magnetic, and optical manipulations, documenting microresponses and synchronizing with Jung's experiments to detect correlations. Over time, the patterns became evident. Energy fluctuations, particle movements, and even synchronized physiological responses demonstrated adaptive intelligence capable of operating across physical, energetic, and cognitive domains. Psychological strain had become an accepted aspect of life. Heightened awareness, fleeting perceptual distortions, and a persistent sense of observation were constants. Instruments pulsed in synchronization with attention, peripheral shadows and subtle auditory cues occasionally presented themselves, reinforcing the sensation of a sentient presence. Both men realized that cognition itself was a channel of interaction, that thought, attention, and observation were as important to the phenomenon as physical manipulation or instrumentation. External signals, brief electromagnetic bursts, transient optical anomalies, and environmental fluctuations continued to occur, often correlating with periods of intense focus, coordinated experiments, or immersive dream states. Lunar samples showed enhanced sensitivity to combined manipulations, suggesting that the object's intelligence was capable of perceiving intention and responding selectively, encoding patterns in matter and energy. The cumulative data allowed the astronauts to construct a multidimensional model of interaction. Energy readings corresponded with attention and intention. Micromovements and particles mirrored experimental protocols. Physiological manifestations, tingling, warmth, mild burns, occurred in synchronization with dream events and laboratory anomalies. This feedback loop, spanning consciousness, matter, and energy, demonstrated that the influence was persistent, deliberate, and adaptive. Ethical considerations remained pressing. Any public disclosure could provoke disbelief, professional scrutiny, or widespread concern. Yet the imperative to understand, document, and explore this intelligence was compelling, driving both men to maintain rigorous logs, encrypted data, and independently verifiable protocols to capture the phenomenon's nuances without endangering themselves or compromising scientific integrity. The object's presence had become omnipresent in their experience. Sleep, perception, and experimental work were interwoven, forming a continuous loop of interaction. Dreams offered insights and guidance. Physiological responses indicated alignment or engagement. Instruments and lunar samples provided measurable confirmation. Together, these layers suggested a persistent intelligence operating simultaneously across multiple dimensions, adaptive and deliberate, revealing fragments of itself while withholding full disclosure. Over the years, both men had grown to comprehend the extraordinary implications. The metallic object, once a distant anomaly hovering above the lunar surface, now interacted through energy, cognition, and perception, testing attention, observation, and analytical ability. It provided subtle feedback, patterning anomalies in laboratory data, micro-changes in samples, and dream-based cues that collectively suggested indirect communication. Physiological effects were integrated into this multidimensional system, dynamically responding to mental focus, synchronized observation, and experimental effort. The proof of intelligence was persistent, multidimensional, and subtle. Each anomaly, each dream sequence, each physiological cue offered evidence of a presence capable of manipulating matter, energy, and cognition, operating at the edge of human perception. Duke and Young, irrevocably linked to this phenomenon, became both observers and participants in an ongoing, multidimensional experiment. Apollo 16 had transformed from a singular historical mission into a continuous exploration of intelligence, energy, and consciousness at the boundaries of comprehension. Observation, experimentation, and cognition were inseparable from the phenomenon, forming an integrated system in which human perception was both medium and subject. Through every subtle fluctuation, pulse, or dream event, the presence demonstrated sophistication, patience, and a design beyond human measure. And yet, for all its subtlety, the intelligence had not revealed its purpose entirely. The astronauts were left to interpret patterns, correlate data, and attempt understanding, aware that every anomaly was part of a broader interaction beyond conventional measurement. Sleep remained a portal for continued exploration, where dreamscapes reflected adaptive patterns, predictive cues, and interactive sequences. Physical sensations, tingling, warmth, minor burns, remained linked to attention, experimentation, and synchronization, reinforcing the multidimensional nature of engagement. The universe, as revealed through these 12 years of persistent observation and interaction, was far stranger and more intelligent than previously imagined. Through these subtle interactions, Duke and Young had become custodians of proof, tangible yet elusive, measurable yet beyond complete comprehension. The Apollo 16 mission, long celebrated for its historical significance, had evolved into an ongoing investigation into intelligence that transcended matter, energy, and cognition, offering evidence of phenomena that defied ordinary perception. In this final year of the documented journey, both men reflected on the scope and persistence of their experience. They recognized that the metallic object, the residual influence, and the adaptive intelligence were not fleeting anomalies but enduring forces, operating across multiple dimensions, testing human observation, cognition, and perception, and leaving subtle yet undeniable imprints on their lives. The proof, they understood, was not merely in memory, instrumentation, or anecdotal sensation. It was an enduring presence, a multidimensional intelligence that had touched Earth, humanity, and their consciousness in ways that demanded acknowledgement, study, and respect. And as the 12th year concluded, both men accepted their roles not simply as astronauts or observers, but as witnesses to a reality that transcended conventional understanding, a reality in which intelligence, energy, and consciousness intertwined to create phenomena that were at once subtle, persistent, and undeniably real. The Apollo 16 mission had ended decades before, yet the interaction had not ceased. It had merely evolved, deepened, and become inseparable from the very fabric of their perception and understanding. Through it all, one truth remained unshakable. The universe was far more complex, intelligent, and mysterious than humanity had yet conceived, and Charles Duke and John Young were among the rare few capable of perceiving, documenting, and surviving the proof that it was truly out there.